We turn our attention to Poitiers, in the spring of 1204, where an 82-year-old woman still dictates letters to scribes. In the ducal palace at Poitiers, on the first day of April in the year 1204, Eleanor of Aquitaine is said to lie in her final illness. She has outlived 2 husbands, most of her children, and nearly every rival who ever stood against her. For decades, she governed the largest duchy in France, was Queen of France and then of England, led armies across the continent, and spent years imprisoned by her husband for supporting her son's rebellion. The candles burn low in the chamber where she breathed her last, still Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, still signing documents that will shape the futures of kingdoms she will not live to see. The harbour at Bordeaux stank of fish and river mud on the morning of July 25th, in the year 1137, as workmen swept the last of the previous night's straw from the approach to the Cathedral of Saint-André. You are standing among the crowd that has gathered before the great west door, where the limestone facade still holds the warmth of yesterday's midsummer heat against your shoulders. Around you, the merchants of Bordeaux have closed their stalls, and the sailors from the Garonne have left their vessels to watch the nobles assemble in their summer silks. The bells begin, and their bronze voices carry across the old Roman streets where Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, is preparing to become a queen. She was born around 1124 in Poitiers, in the Poitou region of France, the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine and Gascony, and Count of Poitou. Her grandfather was William IX, the first known troubadour poet, who died in 1126, around the time of her birth. William IX had composed both vulgar, uncourtly songs and refined canzons, introducing the ideal of courtly love, and his verses still echoed through the halls of the ducal palace where Eleanor had spent her childhood. Now, at 15, she stood as the sole heir to a large duchy on French soil, successor to Carolingian kingdoms that had fragmented and reformed across the centuries. The Atlantic wind from the west carries salt across the vineyards of Poitou as you turn away from the harbour and walk toward the cathedral square. The morning air smells of ripening grapes and the distant sea, a familiar perfume to those raised in the south. Limestone dust rises from the pavement where the masons have been repairing the approach, and it settles on your sleeves like pale ash. Somewhere beyond the city walls, the giant estuary spreads toward the ocean, carrying the trade of Eleanor's vast inheritance from the Loire to the Pyrenees. William X had died in 1137 during a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, leaving his daughter Eleanor as Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right upon her father's death. The death had come suddenly, far from home, and the news had raced northward through the mountain passes to reach the French king before the summer heat had faded from the stone walls of Poitiers. She was placed under the guardianship of Louis VI of France, a man grown old and heavy with illness, who sought to protect the vast duchy stretching from the Loire to the Pyrenees, from the competing interests of Aquitanian nobles and foreign claimants. You press closer to the cathedral door as the procession begins to form, and the scent of parchment and sealing wax drifts from the group of clerks who carry the ducal charters that will soon be transferred to royal custody. The documents are bound in leather and hung with heavy seals that swing against their chests as they walk. The Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux has never seen a gathering of such political weight, and the Archbishop's servants have spent 3 days polishing the floor with beeswax and lavender water. The limestone dust of the Bordeaux Cathedral is cooling now as the morning advances, though the capitals of the columns still retain the memory of yesterday's heat against your palm if you touch them. Louis VI had arranged her marriage to his son, the future Louis VII, and the marriage took place in July 1137 at the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux. The old king had travelled south with painful slowness, his body swollen with the illness that would soon claim him, determined to see the alliance sealed before death could intervene. He had never trusted the southern lords who governed Eleanor's inheritance, and he understood that the marriage gave the French crown direct control over territories that had grown increasingly autonomous since Carolingian times. The contract had been drawn in haste, the clauses debated by candlelight in the ducal palace at Poitiers, where Eleanor's native language was likely Occitan, rather than the French spoken at the Paris court. The unfamiliar northern French dialect echoes in your ears now as the royal party approaches, a harder tongue than the liquid vowels of Occitan that rise from the Aquitanian nobles who flank the bride. You can hear the difference in the greetings exchanged across the cathedral square, the northern speech clipped and brisk against the rolling southern names. Eleanor, some call her, or Eleanor, or Elena, for her name appears in contemporary sources in all three forms, shaped by the mouth of whoever speaks it. The weight of a ducal ring too large for a 15-year-old finger glints on her hand as she moves toward the door, gold catching the morning light that falls through the unfinished rose window above. Her early education had included exposure to troubadour culture through her grandfather's legacy, and the songs of William IX were part of the inheritance she brought northward. The ideal of courtly love, refined in his canzons, spoke of devotion and service, of the lady as sovereign of the heart, a concept that sat uneasily with the political marriage now being consecrated within these walls. The vulgar songs he had also composed, the uncourtly verses that shocked clerical listeners, belonged to a different world than the one Eleanor now entered, yet they formed part of the fabric of her southern upbringing, as much a part of Poitiers as the river that wound through it. You follow the crowd into the nave, where the darkness smells of incense and old stone, and the candles have begun to gutter in their iron holders. The procession moves slowly toward the choir, and you find yourself beside a column where you can watch without being pressed upon. The marriage contract preserved her rights as Duchess of Aquitaine, a clause insisted upon by the southern lords who surrounded their young mistress, and you can see them now, the men of Poitou and Gascony, their faces set in the expressions of those who have surrendered much but not everything. She maintained her own household separate from the French king's court. Another provision rested from the negotiators in the desperate weeks after William X died. The light shifts as clouds pass over the clerestory windows, and the cathedral interior dims to a grey-green underwater color. The voices of the choir rise in the ancient plainsong, and you feel the vibration of the bass notes through the soles of your shoes against the stone floor. The Atlantic wind from the west has found its way through some high opening, carrying salt across the vineyards of Poitou and into this sacred space where a girl stands between two kingdoms. Eleanor was described by contemporaries as beautiful, educated, and strong-willed, and even at this distance you can perceive the straightness of her spine beneath the heavy ducal robes, the deliberate control of each gesture as she turns to face the prince who will become her husband. The ceremony proceeds through its ancient forms, the exchange of rings and the blessing of the union, and you watch the clerks record each stage with their pens of sharpened reed. The scent of parchment and sealing wax intensifies as fresh documents are produced, the ducal charters transferred to royal custody one by one, the seals pressed into soft wax with the authority of archbishop and king. The limestone dust of the Bordeaux Cathedral has settled now into the crevices of the floor, cooling after midsummer heat, and the afternoon light that enters from the west has turned the color of old honey. The news would reach Bordeaux before the marriage feasts had ended, transforming the political meaning of everything that had just been consecrated. She brought Aquitaine to the French crown as her dowry, a major duchy in southwestern France, now bound to a teenage prince who had unexpectedly become king and acquired a wealthy southern heiress. The hurried journey from Poitiers to Bordeaux for the wedding had been watched by Aquitanian nobles at every stage, their future uncertain, their young Duchess passing through towns and villages where her grandfather's songs were still sung. You emerge from the cathedral into the afternoon, and the crowd disperses slowly across the square toward the river, talking in the mixed dialects of a border kingdom. The unfamiliar northern French dialect echoes in Parisian halls that Eleanor has not yet seen, but the liquid vowels of Occitan still rise from the groups of southern lords who gather near the cathedral steps, their faces turned toward a future they cannot predict. The marriage feasts lasted for days, and you wander through the torchlit streets where the ducal kitchens have set up their operations, roasting meat over pits dug in the old Roman Forum. Eleanor's native language was Occitan, not the French spoken at the Paris court, and you hear her voice rise once in greeting to some southern lord, the syllables flowing differently than the northern speeches that surround her. Her name appears in contemporary sources as Eleanor, Eleanor, and Elena, and you hear all three versions in the toasts that drift from the palace windows, the sounds altered by each speaker's origin. She was the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, and she had inherited from him the complex loyalties of a frontier duchy. The duchy, encompassing regions from the Loire to the Pyrenees, contained languages and laws that had developed in partial independence from the northern kingdom, and the marriage gave the French crown direct control over territories that had grown increasingly autonomous since Carolingian times. You stand at the edge of the feast and watch the young queen move among her new subjects, her face composed in the mask of public ceremony, her grandfather's blood showing in the dark eyes that survey each northern face with something like assessment. The first signs of incompatibility between Eleanor's vibrant southern culture and Louis VII's austere piety would not emerge immediately, but they existed in potential from this first meeting, like seeds waiting for the season of their growth. He was a year younger than his bride, raised in the strict atmosphere of his father's court, devoted to the clerical advisors who had shaped his education. She had spent her childhood in the palace at Poitiers, where the songs of William IX, the first known troubadour poet, still formed part of the evening's entertainment, where the ideal of courtly love was spoken of as naturally as the weather. The scent of parchment and sealing wax drifts from the chamber where the young king now sits with his clerks, reviewing the documents that have transferred his wife's inheritance into his hands, while she maintains her own household separate from the French kings caught in the wings of the palace, assigned to her southern retinue. You walk down to the river as the feast continues, and the giant flows past in the darkness, carrying the trade of nations toward the sea. The limestone dust of the Bordeaux Cathedral has washed from your sleeves in the evening damp, cooling after midsummer heat, and the stars are beginning to show above the massif of Saint-André. Somewhere in the palace, Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, Queen of France within days of her wedding, prepares for the journey north that will take her from everything she has known. The unfamiliar northern French dialect will echo in her ears for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the distance she has traveled from the liquid vowels of Occitan that shaped her first words. The morning of departure breaks grey and soft over the harbour where you stand once more, watching the preparations for the royal progress. The road to Paris stretches across the rolling country of central France, and you ride in the dust of the rear guard, watching the long column of horses and wagons wind through the heat-shimmered distances. The Aquitanian nobles who accompany their Duchess ride with the expressions of men leaving their homeland for an uncertain reception, their silks and their weapons marking them as foreigners in the landscape through which they pass. You see her once from a distance as the column halts for water, standing apart from her young husband with a group of southern ladies, their laughter carrying a different music than the sober exchanges of the northern clerks. The unfamiliar northern French dialect grows more common as the days pass, replacing the liquid vowels of Occitan in the villages through which the procession moves. You stay one night in a monastery where the brothers speak a dialect so different from the southern speech that you struggle to follow their prayers, and you think of Eleanor, for whom this linguistic distance will be a daily condition. The scent of parchment and sealing wax reaches you again in the lodging where the royal clerks work each evening, copying the documents that record this progress. The ducal charters transferred to royal custody, now joined by new instruments of government. You stand in the doorway and watch the candles gutter over their work, the shadows of the quills moving against the walls like the wings of captive birds. Paris rises from the river plain in a haze of summer dust, and you enter the city through gates that have never before admitted a queen from the south. The limestone dust of the Bordeaux Cathedral seems another world now, cooling after midsummer heat in a memory that grows softer with each league travelled. The marriage took place in July 1137 at the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux, and already that moment belongs to a past that Eleanor has left behind, a threshold crossed in one direction only. The palace of the French kings receives them with ceremonies that you observe from the margins, too tired from the journey to press for a better position. The Atlantic wind from the west has been replaced by the river breath of the Seine, carrying different smells, different memories, across its slower waters. She was the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine and Gascony, and Count of Poitou, but that lineage now serves a northern monarchy, her southern blood flowing into channels dug by Frankish kings. The first evening in Paris, you walk through the palace gardens as the light fades, and the unfamiliar northern French dialect echoes in the halls behind you, the conversations of courtiers who have come to assess this foreign queen. The liquid vowels of Occitan have not entirely disappeared, for Eleanor's household maintains its separate quarters, and you hear her native language in the songs that drift from an upper window, some troubadour melody learned in childhood, perhaps one of the refined canzons introducing the ideal of courtly love that her grandfather composed, perhaps even one of the vulgar, uncourtly songs that shocked clerical listeners in his own time. William IX had composed both, and his granddaughter carries both traditions within her, the polished and the plain, the sacred and the profane. The marriage gave the French crown direct control over territories that had grown increasingly autonomous since Carolingian times, but the control was not yet secure, the integration not yet complete, and the young queen's household forms a kind of autonomous region within the larger kingdom, a Poitou in miniature, established beside the Seine. You observe them at a feast where the northern clergy frown at the length of the southern musician's performance, where the queen's laughter at some troubadour jest meets the frozen faces of clerical advisers who see sin in every worldly pleasure. You find a bench in a corner of the garden where the wall retains the afternoon warmth, and the evening air moves across your face with the softness of a hand withdrawn. The stars are appearing over Paris, different stars than those that wheel above Poitiers, though the same constellations, the same slow turning of the heavens that watched William IX die in 1126, that watched William X die in 1137 during his pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. Eleanor became Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right upon her father's death, and then Queen of France within days of her wedding, the transformations coming too fast for any gradual adjustment, the girl becoming woman and ruler and foreigner in a matter of weeks. The limestone of the Parisian buildings has a different quality than the stone of Bordeaux, harder, more grey, less warm to the touch. You press your palm against the garden wall and feel the day's heat fading, the stone cooling as the night advances. Somewhere in the palace, Eleanor, whose name appears in contemporary sources as Eleanor, Eleanor, and Eleanor, prepares for sleep in a chamber that is not yet home, surrounded by ladies who speak her native language, which was Occitan, not the French spoken at the Paris court. The unfamiliar northern French dialect will be the first sound of her mornings now, the language of her husband's prayers, his counsels, his dreams. The duchy encompassing regions from the Loire to the Pyrenees, the largest duchy on French soil, successor to Carolingian kingdoms, still exists in her person, still claims her loyalty even as she learns to wear the heavier crown. You rise from the bench and walk slowly toward the quarters assigned to the southern household, your footsteps soft on the garden paths where gravel has been raked into patterns. The scent of night-blooming flowers reaches you from some hidden bed, and the sound of water from a fountain carved in a style older than the Frankish kingdom, perhaps Roman, perhaps older still. The hurried journey from Poitiers to Bordeaux for the wedding, with Aquitanian nobles watching their future, has been extended now into a longer journey without clear destination. The future unfolding day by day in this northern capital, where a southern girl learns the rules of survival. You reach the door of the southern quarters, and the liquid vowels of Occitan drift through the wood, the sound of home for those who have lost home, the sound of Eleanor's childhood preserved in this small enclosure within the larger northern world. The unfamiliar northern French dialect echoes in Parisian halls after the liquid vowels of Occitan, and you stand for a moment between the two sounds, between the two worlds, feeling in your own body the tension that will define this queen's life, the pull of south against north, of duchess against queen, of the self that was against the self that must be made. The door opens to your touch, and the warmth of the interior receives you, the smell of southern herbs and southern oils, the voices of women speaking in the rhythms of Poitiers. You find your place among the pallets laid on the floor, and the sounds gradually soften, the conversations fading into the breathing of sleep. The scent of parchment and sealing wax lingers in your memory, the ducal charters transferred to royal custody, the documents that made and unmade kingdoms with the stroke of a pen. The limestone dust of the Bordeaux Cathedral is cooling somewhere in the darkness, and the stars turn above Paris as they turn above all cities, indifferent to the languages spoken beneath their light. The night deepens. The palace settles into its rhythms of guarded sleep and whispered watchfulness. Somewhere a dog barks once and is still. William IX, the first known troubadour poet, died in 1126, and his granddaughter carries that legacy into a world that does not understand it, that fears what it does not understand, that will try to tame what it fears. The air in the chamber grows cooler, and you pull the light cover closer, feeling the texture of the woven wool against your chin. The unfamiliar northern French dialect has fallen silent in the halls, replaced by the deeper silence of the city sleeping, the river flowing, the hours passing toward a dawn that will bring new ceremonies, new adjustments, new demands upon a young woman who was born around 1124 in Poitiers, in the Poitou region of France. The last embers of the chamber's fire glow faintly against the darkness, and you watch them dim, the red becoming grey, the grey becoming black, the warmth becoming memory. The limestone dust of the Bordeaux Cathedral has found its final resting place in cracks and corners, and the midsummer itself has passed, the year 1137 advancing toward its close, toward the coronation that will confirm what the wedding has begun, toward the trials that wait in the years beyond this threshold night. Your eyes grow heavy, and the shapes of the chamber blur into softness, the edges of things losing their definition as consciousness loosens its hold. The scent of parchment and sealing wax drifts one final time through your awareness. The ducal charters transferred to royal custody, the documents that bind and loose, that create and constrain. Eleanor's arrival at the French court as a foreign-speaking southern duchess among northern nobles has been accomplished, the first stage of a longer passage that will carry her through triumph and disaster, through love and hatred, through the making and unmaking of kingdoms. The tension between her role as Queen of France and her determination to remain Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right sleeps now in the darkness beside you, a seed of future conflict wrapped in the silence of possibility. The breathing around you deepens and slows. The night holds. The stars turn. And somewhere in the palace of the French kings, a 15-year-old girl who was never asked what she wanted dreams of Poitiers, of the river, of the songs her grandfather sang, while the unfamiliar northern French dialect waits for morning to claim her waking hours, to shape her thoughts, to name the world she must now learn to call her own. The breathing around you deepens and slows. The night holds. The stars turn. You are standing in the chapel at Bordeaux in the spring of 1137, where the air carries the scent of melting wax and distant rain over the Garonne. Around you, the bishops have gathered to witness what canon law barely permits. For Louis VII is Eleanor's second cousin, their bloodlines braided too closely through the houses of France and Aquitaine. The papal dispensation lies heavy on the altar, its seals still soft with recent authority, its Latin phrases smoothing over the biological proximity that would otherwise forbid what politics demands. You feel the cold breath of the chapel move across the back of your neck as the vows are spoken, and you notice how Eleanor's voice carries the southern cadence that will mark her as foreign in every hall of the Isle de la Cité. The marriage of 1137 joins the largest duchy in Christendom to the crown of France, and those who watch from the shadows understand that power has shifted in ways no single lifetime can fully measure. The stone beneath your feet carries the memory of centuries, worn smooth by pilgrims and prelates, and the light falling through the clerestory windows divides the space into ribbons of gold and violet. Outside, the rain has begun again, a soft percussion against the leaded glass, while within, the incense rises in thin columns toward the vaulted ceiling. Louis's robes carry the particular weight of Saint Denis upon them, that abbey's influence woven into every thread of his demeanor, every hesitation in his young voice. You observe how his eyes seek the crucifix above the altar rather than the face of his bride, how his hands fold in unconscious prayer, even as the ring slides onto Eleanor's finger. The Abbey of Saint Denis has shaped this prince since childhood, its monks teaching him that earthly glory is but a shadow of heavenly devotion, its abbot Suger standing now among the witnesses with a satisfaction that speaks of France's consolidation rather than any young woman's fate. The years unfold across the cold stone of the Isle de la Cité Palace, where winter settles into the walls with a persistence that southern bones cannot easily endure. You are sitting beside an inadequate hearth in the winter of 1138, then 1139, then the long freeze of 1140, watching Eleanor learn to wrap her hands in ermine while the drafts find every gap in the masonry. The palace hearths throw their heat upward into cavernous ceilings, and the warmth never quite reaches the floor where your feet rest against the chill. Louis moves through these chambers in a manner that suggests he would prefer the cloister, his conversations sparse, his pleasures uncertain, his piety manifesting in fasts that leave him pale and his wife bewildered. The marriage of 1137 promised union, yet the couple's personalities diverge like tributaries seeking different seas. Louis austere and monkish in his devotions, Eleanor cultured and worldly in her appetites for poetry, for music, for the courtly brilliance that Poitiers had cultivated before she ever knew this northern gravity. Around you, the court performs its ceremonies with increasing strain, for the queen's body has twice proven fruitful and twice delivered daughters into a kingdom that demands sons. Marie arrives first, her cries joining the echoing corridors in 1141, and Alex follows in 1143, each birth celebrated with the formal joy that conceals private disappointment. You stand among the midwives and ladies as the news travels to Saint Denis, where the abbot receives it with prayers that the next confinement will bring forth the male heir upon whom the Capetian succession depends. The marriage produced 2 daughters, Marie and Alex, but no sons, and this biological fact begins to work upon the political fabric of France like damp upon stone, invisible at first, then gradually apparent, then structurally significant. Eleanor's failure to produce a male heir strained the marriage politically, though the fault could not be proven to lie in any single womb, and the physicians of the court offered their explanations according to the prejudices of their patrons. The dust of August settles over the roads of Champagne in 1144, where Louis VII has committed his forces against the Count of Champagne in a dispute that seems to him necessary and to others merely vainglorious. You are riding with the baggage train as the army moves through territory that should be friendly, watching the summer wheat stand golden in fields soon to be trampled. The conflict draws Louis into a campaign of maneuver and siege, and you feel the tension in the leather of your saddle as the days pass without decisive engagement. The king's temper, usually restrained by his monastic inclinations, flares in unexpected directions, and those who have known him since childhood remark upon the change with private concern. The marriage of 1137 recedes in memory, its optimism replaced by the accumulated weight of barrenness and battlefield frustration, and the Isle de la Cité seems very distant as the army bivouacs beneath indifferent stars. The night of Vitrienne-Perthois arrives without warning in the chronicle of these years, though its consequences will extend far beyond any single reign. You are standing in the outskirts of the village in 1143, where Louis's troops have pressed their attack with an enthusiasm that outruns command, and the church has become a refuge for hundreds who flee the sword. The torches arc through darkness, and you watch the thatch catch, the flames run, the wooden tower become a chimney of orange and black against the moonless sky. Then the screaming begins, the voices of those trapped inside rising in a chorus that no liturgy can sanctify, no theology can explain away. Louis hears the screams from the burning church, and something in him breaks, some compartment of conscience that his piety had constructed to separate kingly necessity from moral consequence. The smoke carries the smell of human fat and burning hair across the fields where you stand, and the king's face in the firelight shows a horror that his companions will remember in their own later accounts. The moment when Louis VII understood that his soldiers' obedience had made him complicit in something his faith could only call sin. The weeks that follow find Louis withdrawn, fasting in ways that alarm his physicians, visiting the Abbey of Saint Denis with a frequency that suggests penance rather than devotion. You walk with him through the cloister gardens, where the autumn rain has stripped the linden branches to wet bone, and you notice how his fingers trace the rosary beads with a mechanical desperation. The burning of Vitrienne-Perthois traumatized the king in ways that no courtier could address, that no confessor could resolve with the usual formulae of absolution. His guilt contributed to his decision to go on crusade, this expedition becoming in his mind the necessary expiation for a burden that earthly penance could not sufficiently discharge. The marriage of 1137, already strained by the absence of sons, now bears the additional weight of a husband's spiritual crisis, and you observe how Eleanor watches him with an expression that mixes impatience and something that might, in another woman, be called pity. The proposition emerges in the winter of 1145, when Pope Eugenius III preaches the Second Crusade, and Louis seizes upon it with the fervor of the desperate. You are present in the council chamber where the king announces his intention to take the cross, and you watch Eleanor's reaction with particular attention. She insists on accompanying him, bringing her Aquitanian vassals in a retinue that will make her presence impossible to ignore or minimize. The Queen's voice carries the authority of her inheritance as she speaks, reminding those assembled that Aquitaine's knights owe service to her directly, that she has the right to lead them where she chooses. Eleanor's presence on Crusade was unprecedented for a French queen, and the clerical eyebrows rise in unison, though no one present can marshal the canonical argument that would forbid what custom merely discourages. The departure took place in 1147 from Metz, and the preparations of that spring consume the court with their complexity, their logistics, their portentous sense of history being shaped by human will and divine judgment in proportions yet unknown. The dust of the German roads rises around the crusading army in 1147, a constant presence in your mouth and nostrils as the long march across Europe proceeds through territories that owe nominal allegiance to the empire rather than the French crown. You are riding among Eleanor's household, her own retinue conspicuous among the army for its southern elegance, its poets and musicians, its refusal to adopt the austerity that Louis's camp maintains. The contrast between her colorful pavilions and the king's plain tents becomes a subject of comment among the chroniclers who follow the expedition. The marriage of 1137 has become a mobile institution, its tensions transported across the Rhineland and down the Danube, and you feel the dust settle into the creases of your traveling clothes as the weeks become months. The roads of Germany offer no comfort to bodies accustomed to the milder winters of Poitiers, and the cold stone of the Isle de la Cité Palace begins to seem, in memory, like a warmth that was insufficiently appreciated. Around you, the army stretches across the landscape like a river of iron and cloth, the hooves of thousands of horses breaking the silence of forests that have known only hunting parties and pilgrims. The dust rises in columns visible for miles, announcing the Crusaders' progress to villages that must provision them or face requisition. You watch Eleanor ride among her vassals, her posture suggesting a sovereignty that transcends her wifely role, and you understand that this journey offers her something the French court never could: the possibility of action, of agency, of escape from the waiting rooms of queenship. The absence of sons travels with the army like a shadow, present in every diplomatic negotiation, every strategic discussion, every night when the king and queen retire to separate accommodations. The Second Crusade promises redemption for Louis, but for Eleanor it promises something more ambiguous: movement, purpose, the chance to be seen as something other than a failed womb in an inadequate palace. The months in the East bring their own devastations, though these belong to other chronicles than this one. You are present for the return, the long withdrawal that begins in 1149 and extends into the winter of that year, when the crusading army limps back toward France with its objectives unmet and its morale shattered. The marriage of 1137 has become, by this point, a formality maintained by public necessity rather than private affection, and you observe the silences between husband and wife with the attention of one who has watched such silences grow across years rather than weeks. The return from the failed crusade finds the marriage beyond repair, its fractures visible to any courtier with eyes to see and the discretion to keep observations private. The dust of the German roads has long since washed away, but something in both travelers remains marked by the Eastern sun, the Eastern failures, the Eastern proof that piety and arms together cannot guarantee divine favor. The sudden green of the Limousin valleys greets Eleanor as she passes southward in 1150, a colour so intense after the dry plains of the east that you feel your own eyes drink it like water after thirst. She has come to inspect her duchy, to remind its lords of their oaths, to breathe air that does not carry the weight of Saint Denis and its expectations. Around you, the valleys fold upon themselves in patterns that the limestone has carved over millennia, and the rivers run clear over beds of rounded stone. The marriage of 1137 seems distant here, its ceremonies and disappointments belonging to a northern world that Aquitaine accepts only as rumour. You walk beside Eleanor through vineyards where the autumn pruning has left the vines skeletal against the sky, and you understand that she's preparing herself for something that the court would not yet name, but that she, in her worldly wisdom, can already foresee. The cold stone of the Isle de la Cité palace has no power in this landscape, and the hearths that proved insufficient for southern bones seem, in recollection, like symbols of a life she is gradually resolving to leave. The formal dissolution arrives with the inevitability that careful observers have anticipated for years. You are standing in the annulment chamber at Beaugency in 1152, where the silence is broken only by the scratching of clerical pens as they record what church law permits and political necessity requires. The marriage was annulled on grounds of consanguinity, that cousinship which the papal dispensation of 1137 had temporarily overcome, now becoming the instrument of its dissolution. The annulment was granted by the successors of Pope Eugenius III at the Council of Beaugency, those clerics who understood that power must sometimes be rearranged to preserve stability rather than to honor the particular commitments of particular individuals. You watch Eleanor stand before the assembled prelates, her bearing suggesting neither defeat nor triumph, but merely the completion of a process that began in the cold stone of the Isle de la Cité palace, in the inadequate hearth, in the years of waiting for a son who never came. The scratching of pens continues, each stroke recording the dissolution of what had once seemed a union of continental significance. Eleanor retained control of Aquitaine after the annulment, her inheritance returning to her as property that marriage had never truly extinguished. And you observe how the clerics verify this point with particular care, as if the duchy's independence required their textual witness. The dissolution of this marriage is considered one of history's most consequential separations, and those present at Beaugency could not have known, though some may have suspected, that the consequences would extend across centuries rather than decades. The silence of the annulment chamber holds something of the quality of a held breath, the moment before a door opens onto weather that no forecast can predict. You follow Eleanor as she walks away from Beaugency, her duchy intact, her future unwritten. The road beneath her feet carries the dust of centuries, and the trees along its margins stand in attitudes of witness to departures and arrivals beyond counting. Louis VII remarried twice, eventually fathering a son, Philip II Augustus, who would prove one of France's most consequential kings, and the irony of this biological resolution, achieved with another woman's body, does not escape the chroniclers who shaped the narrative for later generations. Eleanor's daughters Marie and Alix remained in Louis's custody, their futures determined by their father's subsequent marriages and the diplomatic calculations these entailed. Marie de Champagne later became a significant literary patron at Troyes, her court fostering the Arthurian romances that would reshape European imagination, and you sense in this later flowering something of her mother's cultural inheritance, the worldly brilliance that the Isle de la Cité could not accommodate finding expression in a daughter's more fortunate circumstances. The marriage of 1137 has ended, yet its consequences propagate like ripples in water disturbed by a stone. It set in motion a conflict between England and France that lasted over 300 years, for Eleanor's subsequent union with Henry Plantagenet would bring Aquitaine under English control and create the territorial disputes that generations would inherit as causes for war. You stand at the crossroads where she pauses, the spring air moving across your face with a softness that belongs to the Limousin, to the valleys she has reclaimed as her own. The sudden green surrounds you, and the songs her grandfather sang seem almost audible in the rustling of new leaves. The dust of the German roads, the cold stone of the palace, the incense-heavy air of St. Denis, all these have been left behind, yet they persist in memory as the textures of a life that was lived, that was real, that shaped what follows as surely as any conscious intention. The night holds, the stars turn. And somewhere in the silence that follows the scratching of pens, a woman who was never asked what she wanted walks toward a future she will now have the power to choose, while the unfamiliar dialects of her past settle into the sediment of history, waiting for other ears, other dreams, other dawns that will find their own words for what the darkness has held. The Second Crusade. A queen on campaign, you are standing in a field outside Vézelay on a morning in March, 1146, where the grass has been flattened by thousands of boots, and the air carries the residue of wood smoke from countless cooking fires. Around you, the crowd stretches to every horizon, a sea of cloaks and hoods and bare heads turned toward a wooden platform that has been raised on the hillside above the abbey. The cold air moves across your face, and you can feel the press of bodies, the warmth of shared breath, the faint tremor of anticipation that passes through gatherings when something believed to be impossible is about to be asked of them. Above the murmur of voices, a single figure rises to speak, and the silence that follows is not the silence of obedience, but of genuine awe, for Bernard of Clairvaux has that quality in his voice which makes men want to surrender what they love. The morning light falls across Bernard's face as he begins to preach, and you notice how the thin spring sun catches the stone of the abbey behind him, turning the pale limestone to a color almost like old ivory. The wind carries his words in fragments, now clear, now lost among the shifting bodies, so that you catch only pieces of the whole. Jerusalem and the fallen kingdom, and the duty of Christian princes to restore what was lost. The sound of weeping begins somewhere to your left, a low sound like rain on thatch, and it spreads through the crowd in waves until thousands are weeping together, a mass emotion that feels less like manipulation than like a door opening in the chest that had been kept locked for too long. The dust rises from the ground as men fall to their knees, as Louis VII, King of France, steps forward to take the cross from Bernard's own hand, his face pale and intense with the fervor that will carry him thousands of miles from everything he knows. The months that follow this morning are filled with preparation, with the slow gathering of supplies and the negotiation of routes through kingdoms that owe no loyalty to French kings. You are standing at the harbor at dawn on June 11, 1147, when the ships begin to load, when Eleanor, Queen of France, steps onto the deck of a vessel with a confidence that the men around her find either admirable or improper, depending on their temperaments. The cold air moves across your face, and you taste the river mist, the particular green smell of water that has traveled through forests and fields to reach this point of embarkation. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes to make room for soldiers, for horses, for the endless barrels of salted meat and hard bread that will sustain an army across the breadth of Europe. The sound of hammers on wood echoes across the water as temporary stalls are dismantled, as the normal commerce of the river gives way to the greater commerce of war. The French army traveled through Hungary and the Byzantine Empire, and you feel the change in the air as the weeks pass, the gradual warming that comes with movement south and east, the slow transformation of landscape from the familiar forests of France to the more open, more exposed terrain of the Hungarian plain. The dry heat of the Anatolian plateau, dust coating everything the Crusaders own, becomes your constant companion, a film on the tongue, a grit in the folds of clothing that no amount of shaking can remove. The light changes too, becomes harder, more vertical, casting shorter shadows at noon than you are accustomed to seeing in your native latitude. Around you, the army moves in a column that stretches for miles when the road permits, a snake of men and animals and wagons that consumes everything in its path, that leaves the land stripped of forage and the wells lowered by feet rather than inches. The nights on this journey are filled with sounds you do not recognize, the calls of insects that belong to other continents, the distant howling of wolves that seem larger and more numerous than their European cousins. You are standing at the edge of a camp on an evening in late September, and the sky above you is impossibly clear. The stars are arranged in patterns that navigators have learned to read, but that remain for you merely beautiful, merely distant. The cold air moves across your face, and you wrap your cloak more tightly, thinking of the fires that burn in the center of the encampment, where Louis VII and his advisors pore over maps that grow less accurate the further east they march. The sound of a lute being played badly drifts from somewhere, a soldier's attempt to remember a song from home, and the tune fragments and repeats, and finally dies away into the larger silence of the plateau. They arrived in Constantinople in October 1147, and you are standing on the deck of a ship as it rounds the promontory that guards the entrance to the Golden Horn, watching the city reveal itself in sections like a scroll being unrolled by a careful hand. The overwhelming gold of Constantinople's churches after months of rough travel strikes you first as a physical sensation, a brightness that makes you raise your hand to shield your eyes, that brings tears to the corners of your vision that have nothing to do with emotion. Around you, vessels have come from every corner of the known world, bearing silks and spices and slaves and the accumulated wealth of centuries of trade. The cold air moves across your face, but it is a different cold here, tempered by the water, carrying the salt of the sea and the particular perfume of a city that has never known siege, that has grown fat and confident behind its walls. Eleanor met with the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, and you were standing in an antechamber of the imperial palace, waiting among other members of the French retinue, listening to the murmur of voices through doors that are thick enough to muffle words, but not to obscure the fact of conversation. The light that falls through high windows is colored by glass that has been set in patterns more complex than any you have seen in French churches, so that the floor seems to move with colored shadows as the sun shifts. The familiar accent of Poitou, suddenly like home, is not present here, and you feel the strangeness of being in a place where no one speaks as you speak, where the gestures of courtesy are similar enough to be recognizable, but different enough to be dangerous, to cause unintended offense. The sound of a gong being struck somewhere in the depths of the palace marks the hour, a sound like no bell you have heard, more resonant, more deliberate. The French continued to Antioch, arriving in March 1148, and the journey from Constantinople has changed something in the army, a thinning of ranks through disease and desertion, a hardening of those who remain into a more desperate, more dangerous version of the force that left Vézelay 2 years before. You are standing on a road that winds through coastal mountains, the Mediterranean visible below you in fragments of impossible blue between the shoulders of hills. The dry heat of the Anatolian plateau has given way to a milder climate, but the dust remains, has become part of the fabric of clothing, of skin, of the very identity of this army that has moved too far to turn back. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes at a village too small to deserve the name of town. A brief pause in the march, while scouts report on what lies ahead, while rumors circulate about the welcome that awaits them in Antioch. The warm reception at Antioch, where a cultured uncle speaks a native tongue, unfolds in gardens that have been maintained through centuries of occupation, through Roman and Persian and Arab, and now Frankish rule, each layer adding its own preferences to the cultivation of pleasure. You are standing beneath an arbor of some flowering vine that you do not recognize, watching as Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch, leads Eleanor through the paths of his palace, their heads bent together in conversation that moves too quickly, too fluently, for the formal interpreters that Louis requires. The familiar accent of Poitou in Raymond's court at Antioch, suddenly like home, surrounds you in the conversations of servants, in the songs that drift from somewhere beyond the garden walls, in the very rhythm of the poetry that Raymond recites to his niece, who laughs in a way you have not heard her laugh in months. The days that follow are filled with consultations that extend beyond the formal requirements of diplomacy, with meetings that take place in rooms where the light falls through screens of carved wood, creating patterns of shadow and brightness that seem to move with the hours. You are standing in a courtyard at noon, watching the play of water in a fountain that has been constructed to represent the 4 rivers of paradise, listening to the sound of voices from an upper window where the Queen and her uncle have been discussing matters of state, of family, of the future of the Crusade that has brought them to this convergence. The overwhelming gold of Constantinople's churches seems distant now, replaced by a different aesthetic of luxury, one that favors intricate pattern over bold statement, the accumulation of small beauties over the shock of single grandeur. Around you, the sounds of commerce drift from streets beyond the palace walls, the ordinary life continuing in the shadow of great events, providing a counterpoint to the intense, the increasingly private conversations that occupy the principles. The sudden rupture comes without warning, or rather it comes with all the warnings that have been ignored by those who did not wish to see them. Louis VII accused Eleanor of improper conduct with her uncle, and you are standing in a corridor of the palace at Antioch on an evening when the temperature has dropped sharply, when the walls seem to radiate the cold they have absorbed through the day. The sound of raised voices reaches you from behind a closed door, a rare breach of the courtly control that normally governs such interactions, and you can distinguish Louis's higher pitch, the note of genuine distress that has entered his accusations, from Raymond's lower, more measured responses, and from Eleanor's voice, which cuts across both with a clarity, a hardness, that suggests she has passed beyond the point of caring what is believed. The cold air moves across your face from a window that has been left open somewhere, carrying the smell of the sea and of the evening fires being lit in the kitchens. She allegedly suggested they remain in Antioch and that her marriage to Louis be annulled, and the suggestion, whether made in the heat of argument or as a genuine proposal, becomes the fracture point that nothing can mend. You are standing in the harbor at dawn, watching preparations for departure that have been ordered with a haste that speaks of wounded pride, and of a husband who can no longer bear to remain in the place where his suspicions have taken root. The salt spray of the Mediterranean, Eleanor on a different ship from her husband, is already present in the air, a presaging of the separation that will become physical as well as emotional in the days to come. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, or trying to, for the disruption of a royal departure has thrown the normal rhythms of the port into chaos, and goods that were meant for other destinations are being requisitioned, reassigned, sacrificed to the urgency of a king who wishes only to be gone from this place. Louis forced Eleanor to leave Antioch and continue to Jerusalem, and the journey south is conducted in a silence more complete than any you have experienced on this campaign, a separation of the royal couple into different households, different routines, different worlds that happen to move in parallel along the same coastal road. You are standing on a hill above the port of St. Simon, watching the ships that will carry the remainder of the army, the light catching the sails in a way that makes them seem almost translucent, almost not there at all. The familiar accent of Poitou has been deliberately left behind, and the language that surrounds you is again the limited, functional French of the military camp, the Latin of the clergy, the various dialects of the servants who have attached themselves to this enterprise. The sound of a horse being exercised on the beach below carries to you the rhythmic splash of hooves in shallow water, a sound that could belong to any century, any journey, any departure from a place that was briefly home. They reached Jerusalem in April 1148, and the city presents itself to you with all the accumulated weight of its meanings, the layers of sanctity and violence and pilgrimage that have made it the center of a world larger than its physical extent could possibly justify. You are standing before the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on a morning when the light seems to come from everywhere at once, reflected from stone that has been polished by centuries of reverent touch, diffused by the incense that rises in steady columns from the ceremonies within. The dust of the Anatolian plateau has been washed away in the ritual baths of arrival, but it remains in memory, in the lines that have been etched into faces by wind and sun, in the permanent alteration of bodies that have been asked to travel too far too fast. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in the streets that lead to the church, for Jerusalem is also a city of commerce, of practical needs that continue even in the presence of the miraculous. The Crusaders' attack on Damascus in July 1148 ended in failure, and you are standing on a plain outside the city walls, watching the disintegration of an army that has come too late, too divided, too uncertain of its purposes to achieve what the first Crusaders accomplished half a century before. The sound of retreat is not dramatic, not marked by the clash of arms or the cries of the wounded, but by the gradual thinning of lines, the discovery that units supposed to be advancing have stopped, have turned, have begun the long walk back to positions that will not be held for long. The failure at Damascus effectively ended the Second Crusade, and you can feel the end in the very quality of the light, which seems to flatten, to lose its capacity for shadow, as if the sun itself has withdrawn interest from what happens below. The humiliating failure before Damascus, the crusade dissolving into recrimination, leaves you standing in a camp that has been struck in haste, in anger, in the mutual blame that will poison the relationships between those who must still travel home together. The overwhelming gold of Constantinople's churches will not be seen again on this journey, will remain a memory of a moment of wonder that was not sustained, that could not survive the realities of what followed. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, or rather they are refusing to, for the collapse of the crusade has disrupted the markets they depended upon, has made the risks of this journey seem suddenly unjustified. The sound of a cart being loaded with wounded men drifts across the space between tents, the low moaning of those who will not survive the return, who have come to this place only to die in it. Eleanor and Louis returned to France by separate routes in 1149, and the decision is presented as practical, as a response to the need to move quickly, to avoid the dangers of a Mediterranean winter, but you understand it as the final recognition of what has been true for months, that the marriage has ended in everything but the formal declaration. You are standing on the quay at Acre, watching as two ships are prepared, as the royal household is divided with a precision that speaks of long planning, of consultations in which the principals did not meet. The familiar accent of Poitou is distant in memory, replaced by the polyglot of this port, where every language of the Mediterranean mixes in the service of departure. They sailed from Acre to Sicily, then overland through Italy, and the journey becomes a series of discrete experiences, of harbours and roads, and the hospitality of courts that receive the travellers with a curiosity undiminished by the news of their failure. You are standing in a garden in Palermo, where the Norman kings have created a synthesis of cultures that seems to you more successful, more genuinely hybrid than anything attempted in the Crusader states. Around you, the sounds of commerce drift from the harbour below, a constant accompaniment that has followed your journey, the reminder that trade continues, that the exchange of goods outlasts the exchange of violence that has occupied your recent years. Pope Eugenius III attempted to reconcile the couple at Tusculum, and you are standing in a room where the furnishings have been arranged with care to create an atmosphere of intimacy, of the possibility of healing, but the arrangement feels like a stage set, like the attempt to impose a narrative of reconciliation on facts that resist it. The light falls through windows that have been opened to the Italian spring, and the quality of that light, its softness, its generosity, seems almost cruel in contrast to the stiffness of the figures it illuminates. The sound of the Pope's voice, gentle, reasonable, trained in the rhetoric of persuasion, fills the space between husband and wife, but you can see in the set of Eleanor's shoulders, in the particular angle at which she holds her head, that the attempt has failed before it has properly begun. The autumn mists of the Loire Valley, unchanged despite all that has passed, seem impossibly distant, belong to a life that has been interrupted too thoroughly to be resumed. The Crusade's failure damaged Louis VII's prestige, and you can see the damage in the way he moves through the courts of Italy, in the slight hesitation before he enters rooms, as if he must remind himself of the authority that once came automatically. You are standing in a cathedral at Benevento, watching as he attends Mass with the devotion that has always characterized his piety, but the devotion seems heavier now, more burdened by the knowledge that his faith has not been sufficient to achieve what he believed it would. The dry heat of the Anatolian plateau has been replaced by the softer climate of Italy, but the dust remains in memory, in the stories that will be told of this campaign, in the gradual construction of a narrative of failure that will attach to his name. Eleanor's conduct in Antioch was used against her in later annulment proceedings, and the seeds of that later use are being planted in the conversations that follow the royal party, in the letters that are dispatched to courts across Europe, in the slow construction of a reputation that will outlast the facts of what actually occurred. You are standing in a doorway at Tusculum, watching as Eleanor emerges from the final interview with her husband, her face composed in a way that suggests not peace, but the exhaustion of all possible emotion, the arrival at a state beyond caring what is believed or what will come. The cold air moves across your face from the corridor behind her, carrying the smell of old stone and of the candles that have burned down in the room she has left. The sound of her footsteps on the tiled floor is precise, unhurried, the walk of someone who has made a decision and will not be turned from it by further argument. The separate journeys home, the marriage effectively ended by geography and mutual consent, continue through the months that follow, through the slow approach to French territory that neither party seems eager to complete. You are standing on a road that winds through the foothills of the Alps, watching a procession that includes neither king nor queen, but only their respective households, moving in a separation that has become formal, almost ceremonial in its completeness. The autumn mists of the Loire Valley begin to manifest as a presence in the conversations around you, as a destination that draws closer with each day's travel, that waits with the indifference of geography for the human dramas that will unfold upon its stage. The final approach to Poitiers comes in a season of falling leaves, of mists that rise from the rivers at dawn and persist until the weak sun burns them away. You are standing on the deck of a ship that has carried Eleanor up the coast from the Mediterranean, that has rounded the peninsula of Brittany to enter the waters that belong to her inheritance, to the duchy that has been hers since childhood, and that now awaits her return as a sovereign in her own right. The salt spray of the Atlantic approaches, colder and fresher than the Mediterranean, marks a return to the climate of her birth that seems almost to restore something that was lost. The sound of gulls follows the ship, their cries familiar from every harbour of this coast, and you watch as Eleanor stands at the rail, her face turned toward a landfall that she has anticipated through years of absence, through the failure of a marriage, through the collapse of a crusade that was never truly hers. The familiar accent of Poitou has found its true home here, in the voices that rise from the quay as the ship approaches, in the greetings of subjects who have waited for their Duchess through the long uncertainty of her absence. You are standing among the crowd that has gathered to witness this return, and the autumn mists of the Loire Valley surround you in a softness that seems to absorb sound, to create a space of gentleness in which the harshness of recent years can be temporarily suspended. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the smell of the river and of the harvest that has been gathered in the fields beyond the town, of fires being lit against the advancing season. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes from vessels that have come from Bordeaux, from La Rochelle, from the trading posts of the Atlantic coast, and the continuity of this commerce, its persistence through war and pilgrimage, and the failures of great persons, offers its own form of consolation. The years that follow will bring the formal ending of what has already ended in fact, the annulment that Pope Eugenius could not prevent at Tusculum, the remarriages and the renewed political calculations that will occupy the remainder of Eleanor's long life. But for this moment, as she steps onto the soil of her duchy, the night holds. The stars turn. Of English winters, Westminster's stone cold even in summer greets you again as you feel the particular quality of a Kentish March, the wind that carries the memory of continental weather across the narrow sea. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the mineral scent of the chalk cliffs, the cries of gulls that wheel above the harbour where the ships of the Angevin Dominion have begun to disgorge their passengers and their cargo. The marriage gave Henry control of Aquitaine, creating a vast continental empire, and in the years that followed the coronation, this empire demanded constant attention, constant movement, the personal presence of the ruler in each territory to prevent the centrifugal forces of local ambition from dissolving the whole into its constituent parts. You are walking through the streets of Rouen, where the market day has brought the farmers of the Seine Valley into the city, where the stalls display the produce that will feed the court for another season. Around you, the voices rise in the Norman dialect that Eleanor has learned to understand, the particular inflections that distinguish the people of this duchy from their neighbours in Anjou and Maine. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the scent of ripe cheese and fresh bread, the ordinary commerce that continues beneath the great affairs of state, the buying and selling that sustains the populations who will be summoned to war or tax to pay for the castles and the courts. You are standing in the chapel of the castle at Falaise, where the tombs of the earlier dukes remind every visitor of the antiquity of Norman power, of the Viking origins that still colour the identity of this people. Around you, the candles burn before the effigy of William the Conqueror, the founder of the dynasty whose claims Henry has now extended across the Channel. The cold air moves across your face from the narrow windows, where the light falls in shafts that illuminate the dust in its slow circulation. the motes that seem to dance in the stillness of this place of memory and prayer. Henry's policy aimed at consolidating these territories into a single realm, and in this ambition, he looked back to the example of his great-grandfather, the conqueror who had held England and Normandy in a personal union that prefigured the larger dominion the young Henry now constructed. The 2-year wait for the English throne, Eleanor governing her continental lands, seems in retrospect a brief interlude, but for those who lived through it, the uncertainty must have appeared endless, the possibility of failure as vivid as the promise of success. You are sitting in the solar of the palace at Angers, where Eleanor has established her household for the winter of 1154, where the fire burns high against the cold that seeps through the walls of this ancient stronghold. Around you, the women of her court attend to their needlework, their voices low in the conversation that passes the hours of indoor confinement, the stories and the gossip that bind a household together through the long months when travel is impossible. The cold air moves across your face from the opened shutter, where the snow has begun to fall on the city below, the soft descent that transforms the familiar streets into a landscape of strangeness and beauty. Eleanor continued to issue charters as Duchess of Aquitaine, and in the first years of her marriage to Henry this activity intensified, the assertion of her separate identity through the documentary record that would preserve her authority for future generations. You are present in the chamber where a charter is being sealed, where the warm wax is pressed with the ducal matrix that Eleanor has brought from Poitiers, the seal that declares her independent status to all who receive this document. Around you, the witnesses gather, the bishops and the nobles whose presence validates the transaction, whose names will be read aloud in the formal Latin that structures these legal acts. The cold air moves across your face, and you notice how the light of the winter afternoon fails early, how the candles must be brought to complete this business before the darkness makes further work impossible. You are walking through the vineyards of the Loire Valley, where the spring of 1155 has brought the court for the Easter celebrations, where the new growth shows green against the brown of the pruned canes. Around you, the laborers work between the rows, their hoes turning the soil that will nourish the vintage of this year, their songs rising in the patois of the region that Henry claims as his own through his father Geoffrey, the Count of Anjou, whose emblem of the broom plant gave this dynasty its lasting name. The cold air moves across your face in the morning, before the sun has warmed the valley, and you feel the particular quality of a Loire spring, the moisture that rises from the river, the promise of warmth that will transform this landscape in the weeks to come. Their union produced 8 children: William, Henry, Matilda, Richard, Geoffrey, Eleanor, Joan, and John. And in the years between 1153 and 1166, Eleanor would bear these children with the regularity that confirmed her fertility, the fundamental requirement of every royal marriage that her union with Louis had so conspicuously failed to satisfy. The cry of the first Plantagenet son, born into a kingdom his mother helped seize, echoes in your memory as you stand in the chamber where the infant has been laid in his cradle, where the women watch over this child who carries the hopes of a new dynasty. Around you, the quiet of the nursery prevails, the hushed voices that attend upon the vulnerable young, the careful movements that must not disturb the sleep that restores and grows. William would not live to see his second year, this first son whose birth had been so celebrated, whose death would demonstrate the fragility of all human plans, the mortality that stalks even the palaces of kings. You are standing in the great hall of the palace at Westminster, where the court has gathered for the Christmas celebrations of 1155, where the fires burn against the damp that seeps through the stone of this island fortress. Around you, the nobility of England and Normandy mingle in the uneasy proximity that Henry's rule has imposed, the conquered and the conquerors, the Saxon survivors and the Norman aristocracy that has displaced them, all now subjects of this young king, whose energy promises to transform the exhausted kingdom he has inherited. The unfamiliar damp of English winters, Westminster's stone cold even in summer, presses against the windows where the condensation gathers and runs in slow rivulets down the glass. The cold air moves across your face, and you feel the particular quality of English December, the darkness that closes in before the afternoon has properly begun, the sense of suspension that belongs to a season when the world seems to hold its breath between the death of the old year and the uncertain birth of the new. They spent relatively little time in England, governing from their continental territories, and in this pattern you can perceive the priorities of a ruler whose imagination remained fundamentally continental, whose ambitions looked south to Toulouse and east to the Rhine rather than north to the Scottish border or west to the Welsh mountains. You are walking through the streets of Paris, where Henry has come to do homage to Louis VII for his French possessions, the strange ritual that requires the stronger prince to kneel before the weaker, to acknowledge a theoretical overlordship that the realities of power have long since emptied of meaning. Around you, the crowds gather to witness this display of the feudal order, the pageantry that sustains the appearances even when the substance has departed. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the particular scent of Paris, the smoke of 10,000 hearth fires, the refuse of the streets, the incense from the churches that rises in thin columns toward the grey sky. She was determined to prevent Aquitaine from being absorbed into Henry's empire, and in this determination, Eleanor found an ally in the very separateness of the Angevin territories, the multiplicity of centres that prevented any single court from dominating the whole. You are standing in the hall of the palace at Poitiers, where the ducal court has assembled, where the poets and the musicians perform the songs that have made this city famous throughout the Christian world. Around you, the voices rise in the Languedoc, the southern tongue that Eleanor has preserved against the northern French of her husband's dominions, the language of the troubadours that celebrates the refined love, the courtly sentiment that distinguishes the culture of Aquitaine from the harsher values of the north. The overlapping sense of parchment from two kingdoms, French wax and English seals, surround you in the chamber where the administrative work of this double realm proceeds, where the clerks labor to maintain the coherence of an empire that geography and custom conspire to fragment. You are sitting at a table where the documents are being sorted, where the separate roles of England and Normandy, of Anjou and Aquitaine, lie in their separate piles, awaiting the attention of the officials who must coordinate the actions of this vast and unwieldy dominion. Around you, the quiet industry of government continues, the copying, the sealing, the dispatching of instructions that will attempt to hold together what distance and diversity threaten to pull apart. You are standing at the harbour of Barfleur, where the royal party has gathered for the crossing to England, where the ships wait to carry the king and queen across the water that separates their continental dominions from the island realm they must periodically visit to maintain their authority. Around you, the sailors make their preparations, the coiling of ropes, the loading of the chests that contain the records and the regalia, the anxious calculations of tide and wind that govern every channel crossing. Eleanor's lands were crucial to this consolidation, and in her husband's constant returns to the continent, she found the rhythm that suited her own governance, her own insistence on the separate identity of Aquitaine within the larger structure of Angevin power. The territory they controlled became known as the Angevin Empire, though no contemporary used this term, which belongs to historians seeking patterns in the map of 12th century power, the convenience of a label that obscures the personal and contingent nature of Henry's dominion. You are walking through the streets of Bordeaux, where the autumn market has brought the products of the southern lands into the city, the wine and the salt, and the dried fruits that will sustain the court through the winter months. Around you, the voices rise in the Gascon dialect that Eleanor understands without effort, the language of her childhood that connects her to these people in ways that her husband, for all his power, cannot replicate. You are standing in the chapel of the palace at Westminster, where the court has gathered for the Easter celebrations of 1156, where the ceremonies of the church mark the passage of another year in the life of this young dynasty. Around you, the candles burn before the altar where the king has received the communion that binds him to his subjects in the shared faith of the Christian community, the ritual that sustains the theoretical unity of a realm that practical governance perpetually divides. The marriage was politically strategic, but personally volatile from the start, and in the tensions that already show between husband and wife, in the separate households they maintain and the separate itineraries they follow, you can perceive the fault lines that will eventually divide this partnership into opposition. You are walking through the gardens of the palace at Winchester, where the spring of 1156 has brought the court for a rare extended stay in England, where the fruit trees show their first white against the walls of this ancient capital. Around you, the gardeners prepare the beds that will supply the kitchen, the planting of herbs and vegetables that will flavor the meals of the coming season. Around you, the fires burn high against the winter cold, the logs of the Norman forests consumed in the celebration of a dynasty that has continued to multiply. You are walking through the cloister of the abbey at Fontevraud, where Eleanor has come to pray, where the stone has warmed in the May sunshine, where the roses have begun to open against the walls that enclose this space of contemplation. Around you, the nuns move in their ordered rounds, their sandals soft against the paving, their voices rising and falling in the Latin of the hours that structures their separation from the world's concerns. The cold air moves across your face, but it carries now the sweetness of pollen and nectar, the particular fragrance of a Loire Valley spring that Eleanor has known since childhood, that she will claim again in the years to come, when this abbey becomes her refuge and her burial place. You are standing in the chamber where the court council has assembled, where the great men of the realm debate the policies that will govern the coming year, the campaigns against the Welsh, the negotiations with the emperor, the endless adjustments of authority and precedence that occupy the rulers of a composite state. Around you, the voices rise and fall in the several languages of this dominion, the French of Normandy and Anjou, the Latin of the church and the administration, the English of the island kingdom that Henry must now claim as his own. Around you, the sailors coil the ropes and stow the cargo, the chests of records and clothing and the personal possessions that accompany a court constantly in motion. You are standing at the rail, where the wind carries the spray in stinging particles across your face, where the horizon shifts and steadies with the motion of the vessel. Around you, the other passengers huddle in their cloaks, the clerks and the nobles and the servants who make up the travelling court, their faces set against the discomfort of this necessary passage. The cold air moves across your face in gusts that speak of the larger weather systems that govern this narrow sea, the depressions that sweep in from the Atlantic to bring rain and wind to the coasts of England and Normandy, the meteorological unity that geography has imposed upon these divided realms. You are walking through the streets of Poitiers, where the court has established itself for the winter of 1157, where the Christmas celebrations will be held in the palace that Eleanor's ancestors built, the seat of the duchy that remains her own. Around you, the citizens prepare for the festival, the cleaning of streets, the decoration of churches, the provisioning of the markets that will supply the feasts of this season. You are standing in the chamber where Eleanor receives the messengers from her husband's court, where the letters are read and the instructions decoded, where the negotiations proceed that will determine the governance of this vast and fragmented realm. Around you, the clerks copy the responses, the careful Latin that maintains the forms of marital cooperation even as the substance departs. Around you, the musicians practice in an alcove, their instruments tuning to the particular intervals of the Aquitanian repertoire, the songs that Eleanor has known since childhood and that she patronizes now as Duchess and Queen. The couple held Christmas court together at various locations, including Bordeaux and Limoges, and in these movements between their territories, they maintained the public appearance of unity that every political marriage requires, the shared ceremonies that declare to the world the partnership that private discord increasingly belies. Around you, the quiet industry of government continues, the accumulation of decisions and confirmations that will preserve the rights and properties of this vast dominion for another year, another generation, the patient construction of institutional memory that outlasts the lives of individual rulers. Around you, the banners hang motionless in the still air of the chamber. The devices of the families whose support has sustained the Plantagenet rise, whose loyalty must be constantly renewed and rewarded. The cold air moves across your face from the high windows, where the afternoon light falls in shafts that illuminate the dust motes in their slow procession toward the floor. You are walking through the vineyards of the giant, where the autumn of 1158 has brought the court to Bordeaux, where the harvest has been gathered and the new wine rests in its casks. Around you, the laborers burn the pruned canes, and the smoke rises in thin columns against the pale sky, carrying the tart scent of wood and leaf that marks this season of completion and preparation. You are standing at the harbour of Southampton, where the ships wait to carry the royal household back to Normandy, where the baggage has been loaded and the horses stand restless in their stalls. Around you, the merchants of the port conduct their business with the efficiency of those who know that royal departures mean opportunities for trade, unencumbered by the exactions and competitions of court presence. Around you, the particular atmosphere of a birth chamber subsides into the exhausted quiet that follows successful delivery, the mingled sense of blood and herbs, and the clean linen that has been prepared for this moment. You are sitting at the table where Eleanor presides, where the dishes succeed one another in the elaborate choreography of the Christmas feast, where the conversation rises and falls in the several languages of this cosmopolitan court. Around you, the musicians play the songs of the troubadours that Eleanor has patronized, the verses that celebrate the refined sentiments of courtly love, the idealized devotion that masks the political calculations of every aristocratic marriage. You are standing in the chapel of the cathedral at Poitiers, where the Easter ceremonies of 1160 have brought the court to witness the consecration of a new bishop, the ritual that binds the spiritual and temporal powers in the mutual dependence that structures the medieval state. Around you, the clergy process in their ordered ranks, the candles and the incense rising in the shafts of spring light that fall through the windows of colored glass. The cold air moves across your face, tempered now by the warmth of bodies pressed into this confined space, by the candles that have been lit for a ceremony that maintains the ancient forms even as the political substance of the realm undergoes its constant transformation. You are walking through the streets of London, where the court has established itself for the autumn of 1163, where the Michaelmas term has brought the justices and the lawyers to Westminster for the business of the law. Around you, the crowds press through the narrow ways, the merchants and the artisans, the peasants come to market with their produce, the pilgrims bound for the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, though the archbishop still lives and the martyrdom that will make his tomb famous still lies in the future. The unfamiliar damp of the English coast settles upon your shoulders as the royal party makes its way from the harbour toward the waiting horses, the white cliffs of Dover still visible behind you in the pale morning light. Around you, officials continue their examinations, voices low and methodical against the sound of waves upon the shingle. The transition from Poitiers to this northern kingdom marks another passage in the long itinerary of Eleanor's court, another boundary crossed between the world of southern sun and this grey island, where her authority operates differently, where the cadences of Aquitaine seem distant and strange to English ears. You are walking now through streets that remember Norman conquest, through air that carries the salt of the Channel and the smoke of domestic fires, toward lodgings that will serve as temporary court, while business of the realm proceeds in its deliberate fashion. The resonance of a vielle in a Poitevin hall lingers still in your memory, strings tuned to modes now forgotten, though the instrument itself remains far to the south in chambers where musicians await their patron's return. In Poitiers, in the halls that Eleanor's grandfather William IX once commanded, music would rise in the evenings, the bow drawing across gut strings to accompany verses composed in the tongue of Aquitaine, that language of southern France which William IX spoke and sang, and shaped into something enduring. The flicker of torchlight on painted ceilings depicting scenes of love and combat would illuminate faces turned toward the performer. The noble assembly gathered to hear what new composition had arrived, or what familiar song would be given again in the warm air of the hall. You can almost feel the particular weight of the silence between verses, the expectation of the audience held in suspension as the vielle's note decayed into the stone and timber of the chamber. William IX established the troubadour tradition in Aquitaine. This much the sources confirm. This much echoes through the decades between his death and his granddaughter's mature reign, between the songs he improvised and the culture Eleanor now sustains in the spaces she commands. The ideal of Finema's or refined love in his poetry became something that subsequent generations would elaborate, would weave into more complex tapestries of convention and expectation, until the simple praise of a lady's beauty transformed into an intricate code of behavior, of suffering, of service, rendered in hope of recognition. You are standing now in an English courtyard, yet your thoughts return to those southern halls where the grandfather's legacy persists in the granddaughter's patronage, where the boundaries between politics and art blur in ways that serve both purposes without fully declaring either. The particular cadence of Aquitaine, its rhythms different from northern French, would have marked the social boundaries of Eleanor's court as clearly as the quality of garments or the intricacy of genealogies. A language of courtship and of commerce, of poetry and of administrative record, it connected the coastal towns of the Mediterranean to the inland valleys, where vineyards produced the wine that accompanied both celebration and daily sustenance. You can hear it still in the fragments that survive, in songs preserved by later collectors, in place names that persist upon maps despite centuries of political transformation. The contrast between northern French and southern Occitan culture remained significant throughout this period, a division of language that mapped onto differences of law, of custom, of the very gestures by which nobility acknowledged one another in passing. Eleanor moved between these worlds with the fluency of long practice, her childhood in Poitiers having formed her ear to the southern sounds, her marriages and her travels requiring accommodation to the northern tongue and its speakers. The smell of ink and oak gall where scribes preserve songs that began as improvisation drifts through your imagination as you consider the labor of transmission, the slow transformation of fleeting performance into durable record. In the scriptoria that served the court, Whether in Poitiers or in the various locations of royal progress, the work of copying proceeded through long hours, the quill moving across prepared parchment, the careful formation of letters preserving for later eyes what had once existed only in the moment of utterance, in the particular resonance of a hall, in the immediate response of listeners whose own attention shaped what the performer gave. The weight of silk from Constantinople, traded across the Mediterranean for songs and stories, would have passed through these same spaces, luxury goods of Eastern manufacture exchanged for the cultural products of Western courts, the economics of prestige interweaving with the aesthetics of praise, until the distinction between material and immaterial wealth became difficult to sustain. Eleanor's court at Poitiers became a center of literary culture, though the precise contours of that culture resist the historian's desire for concrete detail, the contemporary sources for her cultural activities being sparse in ways that frustrate and intrigue. You are observing now the difficulty of the modern historian's dilemma. The real Eleanor versus the one literature created, the flesh and blood of administrative documents against the luminous figure of later imagination. The gathering of poets and nobles at Poitiers, the boundaries between politics and art blurred, can be asserted with reasonable confidence, yet the specific occasions, the named individuals beyond a few certain examples, the very conversations that may have occurred, remain largely inaccessible behind the veil of incomplete record. What remains is atmosphere without event, possibility without particularity, the general conditions from which specific instances might be inferred but cannot be demonstrated. Evening approaches in this English lodging, and the domestic illumination here, less elaborate than the decoration of southern halls, serves similar purposes of transformation, the ordinary made remarkable through attention and artifice. Around you, servants prepare for the night's rest, movements quiet and practiced, their own speech a dialect of this northern island marking their place in the social order as clearly as the quality of their garments. The Viel seems very distant now, yet persists in the imagination as emblem of what this court sustains against the pressure of geography and of political necessity, the cultural network that connects Poitiers to other centers of refinement and influence. The daughter Marie, carrying similar traditions to Champagne, represents one thread of this network, a cultural connection across France that extended the southern mode into northern territories through the mechanism of aristocratic marriage and the patronage that accompanied it. Marie de Champagne maintained similar patronage at Troyes, her own court becoming a recognized center where the conventions of Finamas received further elaboration, where the conversation about love's nature and proper expression continued in a different accent, among participants formed by different local traditions, yet responsive to the prestige of the southern origin. Marie supported Création de Troyes, originator of the courtly romance, that literary form which would carry the ideals of refined love into narratives of adventure and quest, embedding the conventions of praise and service within structures of action and transformation that proved extraordinarily durable, that would influence European literature for centuries in ways that continue to shape expectation and representation. You are standing now at the window of your chamber, looking out upon a courtyard where the evening light fades into the obscurity of northern dusk. The particular quality of this island twilight, different from the long evenings of Aquitaine, where the sun declines more slowly toward the western sea. The cadence of Occitan would have marked Marie's speech as it marked her mother's, a maternal inheritance of sound that accompanied the dowry goods and the political alliances that connected daughter to grandfather across the distance of generation and of separate households. The cultural connection between Aquitaine and courtly love persisted for generations, long after the specific individuals had passed from living memory into the retrospective constructions of chroniclers and poets, long after the political structures that sustained the courts had transformed or dissolved. The courts of love at Poitiers are described in later sources, particularly Andreas Capellanus, whose treatise on love's practice provides one of the most elaborate accounts of what might have occurred in the spaces Elena commanded. Andreas Capellanus wrote De Amore Libri, tres around 1190, a work that purports to describe judgments delivered in formal proceedings where questions of love were debated and resolved according to established principles, where ladies presided over assemblies of lovers who presented their cases for evaluation and determination. Yet the historicity of formal courts of love is disputed by modern scholars, the evidence for actual institutionalized proceedings being slender against the probability that Andreas constructed an elaborate fiction, a playful or pedagogical exercise that subsequent readers mistook for documentary record. You are considering now the seduction of such forms, the appeal of imagining Elena as presiding genius over ceremonies of refined sentiment, the image that gathers to itself the scattered indications of cultural activity and shapes them into coherent narrative. The smell of ink and oak gall returns as you contemplate the material basis of this uncertainty, the documents that survive against those that have perished, the accidents of preservation that determine what can be known. The Chansonniers preserve troubadour lyrics in illuminated manuscripts, those collections made for wealthy patrons in the 13th century and after, gathering scattered compositions into deliberate assemblages that impose their own logic of organization upon material that may originally have circulated quite differently. The shift from oral performance to written collection occurred gradually across this period, a transformation that altered the conditions of reception, that made possible the solitary encounter with text in place of the social occasion of performance, that changed the relationship between poet and audience in ways that perhaps the participants themselves would not have anticipated or desired. The weight of silk from Constantinople would have adorned some of the patrons whose names appear in these collections, the material signs of prestige accompanying the cultural products they commissioned or receive. Elena's direct patronage of troubadours is less documented than later legends suggest, the specific names and occasions that would substantiate the claim of active sponsorship being largely absent from the surviving record. The image of Elena as queen of the troubadours derives largely from later literary works, from the accumulation of attribution and association that transformed a politically astute noblewoman into an emblem of cultural refinement, a figure in whom the aspirations of subsequent generations found their appropriate vehicle. You are observing this process of gradual transformation of memory, Elena becoming more legendary with each generation, the historical person increasingly obscured by the requirements of narrative and of symbolic representation. The resonance of a vielle in a Poitevin hall persists as acoustic memory, a suggestion of what these spaces might have contained, even as the specific occasions resist recovery. Richard I, Elena's son, was known as the Troubadour King, this epithet attaching to him in part through maternal association, in part through his own documented cultivation of poetic composition, the family tradition extending across gender and across generation to maintain the cultural prestige that William IX had established. The particular cadence of Occitan would have been familiar to Richard from childhood, part of the linguistic inheritance that accompanied his status as Duke of Aquitaine, that connected him to territories and populations that his royal position in England could not fully assimilate or supersede. The flicker of torchlight on painted ceilings illuminates now, In your imagination, the chamber where the 20th century would locate its own version of this history. The 1968 film The Lion in Winter, cementing a largely fictional image in popular understanding. The performances of actors in that production, the dialogue invented for dramatic purposes, the conflicts exaggerated and simplified for narrative effect. All of these have shaped subsequent perception more profoundly than the surviving documents of the 12th century. The historical Eleanor receding before the figure who occupies the screen and the imagination. You are considering the irony of this displacement, the modern medium's power to establish what seems authentic against the fragile persistence of archival record, the emotional truth of performance substituting for the partial truths of documentary survival. The smell of ink and oak gall returns as emblem of the alternative, the patient labor of transmission that preserves without glamorizing, that maintains the possibility of encounter with past voices without the mediation of dramatic reconstruction. Eleanor's court would have included music, poetry, and discussion of love's rules. This much can be asserted with reasonable confidence against the uncertainty of specific occasion and individual participant. The general conditions of aristocratic life in this period required such cultural display, the performance of refinement serving political purposes of distinction and alliance, the cultivation of artistic appreciation marking the boundaries of privileged status against those excluded from such education and such opportunity. You are standing now at the close of day, the English dusk having deepened into darkness, the sounds of the household diminishing toward the silence of night. The weight of silk from Constantinople seems very distant in this island kingdom, yet the trade routes persist, the connections between East and West that brought luxury to Poitiers continuing to operate through the ports and markets that commerce requires. The cultural network that extended from Aquitaine to Champagne and beyond, that connected mother and daughter in shared patronage despite political separation, that transmitted the troubadour tradition across generations of performers and audiences. This network persists in the material traces that survive, in the manuscripts and the documents and the architectural remnants that permit the historian's partial reconstruction. The resonance of a vielle in a Poitevin hall sounds one final time in your awareness as you prepare for rest, the acoustic image dissolving into the actual silence of this English night. Modern historians caution against accepting later romanticized accounts as factual, yet the romanticized accounts possess their own historical reality as documents of subsequent desire, as evidence of what later generations found meaningful in the figure of Eleanor, what they needed her to represent. The ideal of courtly love influenced European literature for centuries, its conventions persisting through transformation and adaptation, its structures of feeling surviving even when the specific social conditions that produced them had long since disappeared. You are releasing now the effort of historical imagination, allowing the darkness to receive these fragments of attention, these accumulated impressions of a past that persists only in the traces that remain, in the songs that survive, however imperfectly, in the stories that attach to names and places and continue to circulate beyond any individual act of recollection. The flicker of torchlight on painted ceilings fades into the darkness of closed eyes, the particular cadence of Aquitaine becoming indistinguishable from the rhythms of approaching sleep. Around you, the household settles into its night arrangements, the distant sounds of others rest accompanying your own descent toward unconsciousness. The smell of ink and oak gall lingers as last sensory impression, the labor of transmission continuing even as the individual consciousness releases its hold upon the day's accumulated experience. The weight of silk from Constantinople has been folded and stored, the luxury goods awaiting their next occasion of display, their next opportunity to signify the prestige of those who possess them. Poitiers persists in darkness, as Troyes persists, as the various locations of Eleanor's passage through her long life persist in the documentary record and in the legendary accretion that surrounds it. The boundaries between what occurred and what was later imagined to have occurred have become indistinct, perhaps were always indistinct, the present moment's understanding shaped by the accumulated weight of previous interpretation. You are drifting now across the threshold of consciousness, the historical imagination releasing its objects into the freer associations of dream, where the vielle may sound without performer, where the painted ceiling may illuminate without flame, where the voices of the past may speak without the constraint of surviving evidence. The night receives these possibilities, the darkness generous in its acceptance of what the waking mind would distinguish and discriminate, the sleep that approaches offering its own form of court, its own ceremonies of release and return. The harbour at dawn carries a particular grey, the colour of unpolished silver, and you are standing at its edge where the fishing boats have begun their daily departure. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of salt fish and wine barrels, their voices low and rhythmic, a language of numbers and weights. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the damp of the channel and something else, something sharper, the scent of parchment and sealing wax, of secrets prepared for travel. In the year 1173, this harbour at Southampton sees more than commerce pass through its customs. Letters travel in the folds of cloaks, in the lining of travelling chests, in the hollow heels of boots. Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine, Queen of England, has learned to write in codes that her husband's clerks cannot decipher, to trust messengers who know the roads through Anjou and the Loire better than they know their own prayers. The water at your feet shifts with the tide, each small wave erasing the footprints of gulls, and you understand how quickly evidence disappears in this world of fluid allegiances. Eleanor's sons, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, have grown to manhood in the shadow of a father who granted them titles without power, who kept the reins of government wound tight in his own capable hands. Young Henry, crowned king in his father's lifetime, chafes at the emptiness of his coronation. Richard, raised in his mother's Aquitaine, speaks the Langue d'Oc as his native tongue, dreams of the south that Eleanor's lineage commands. Geoffrey, Breton by marriage and temperament, watches his brothers with calculating eyes. The parchment you might touch, there on the rough wooden counter where the harbour master keeps his records, would bear traces of their mother's encouragement, her strategic mind working through channels that only a woman of 51 years could navigate with such precision. Light falls through the clouds in pale columns, illuminating patches of the grey water as though stage and audience were being prepared for some performance still hours distant. The boats rock at their moorings, their masts describing slow arcs against the whitening sky. Somewhere to the east, beyond your sight, Louis VII of France moves through his chambers at Paris, his piety undiminished by the failures of his marriage to Eleanor, his memory of her vast southern territories sharpened by their loss. Louis encourages the rebellion of her sons against Henry II with the quiet satisfaction of a chess player who sees the board from a distance, who need not touch the pieces to influence their movement. The former husband and the current husband, bound by the woman they both claimed, by the children she gave to one and withheld from the other. The correspondence between the French court and the rebellious princes passes through Eleanor's hands, her network of southern connections, her memory of roads and safe houses from a lifetime of travel between Poitiers and Paris. The texture of the harbour stones beneath your boots is rough, worn by centuries of fishing and departure, and the morning has advanced sufficiently that the first warmth touches the back of your neck. though the wind retains its edge. In the great hall at Chinon, where you might have stood a month before, the atmosphere has grown heavy with suspicion. Henry II moves through his domains with the restless energy that has defined his reign, from England to Normandy, from Anjou to Aquitaine, never sleeping 2 consecutive nights in the same chamber, as though the kingdom itself required his constant motion to maintain its coherence. His eyes, which clerks describe as bright and penetrating, have begun to notice patterns in the movements of his wife's household, the unexpected destinations of her messengers, the silences that fall when he enters rooms where correspondence was moments before being composed. The particular cold of Winchester in winter will come to Eleanor, but for now, the autumn of 1173 still holds the last warmth of her southern blood, her 51 years not yet bowed by the confinement that approaches. You can smell the wood smoke rising from the kitchens of the castle that dominates the harbour town, the particular savour of hearth bread and the thin beer of morning. The rebellion of her sons has not yet collapsed, though the military campaigns have proven indecisive, the castles changing hands with the seasonal campaigns, the fields lying untended where armies have passed. Eleanor believes, or must believe, that the pressure of combined forces, French, Breton, Angevin, Poitevin, will force her husband to grant the independence that his sons demand, and that she, by extension, will recover the autonomous power that marriage to Henry has systematically diminished. The sound of her own breathing in chambers where no music plays has not yet become her acoustic reality. For now, music still surrounds her. The vielle in the evening, the voices of her household singing the songs of troubadours she once patronized at Poitiers, the distant bells of Easter that still mark the calendar of her faith. The rebellion continues through the winter of 1173 and into the spring of 1174. Henry II returning from his continental territories to secure his English kingdom against the Scottish invasion that Louis VII has encouraged in coordination with the prince's revolt. The complexity of these alliances, the multiple fronts of this familial war, would require a cartographer of loyalties to trace, and even such a cartographer would find the lines shifting beneath his instruments. The narrowing of windows at Salisbury, the world reduced to rectangles of light, belongs to a future that Eleanor cannot yet imagine as you stand at this harbour, watching a falconer exercise his bird above the tidal flats. The gulls scatter before the predator's shadow, their cries sharp and repetitive, a language of alarm that requires no translation. Henry II, landing in England in the summer of 1174, moves with the decisiveness that has characterized his response to crisis throughout his reign. The capture of William the Lion at Elnwick removes the Scottish threat. The collapse of the rebellion follows with the mechanical inevitability that Eleanor, student of power, must recognize even as she resists its implications. Her sons scatter to the protection of French territory, their military pretensions exposed as the fantasies of impatient youth. The confrontation with Henry, the long marriage ending in mutual accusation, occurs in circumstances that chroniclers would later dispute, each account colored by the allegiance of its author. You are not present at this confrontation, but you might stand in the antechamber where the household waits, hearing the rise and fall of voices through thick oak doors, the particular quality of silence that falls when speech becomes too dangerous for witnesses. Henry II discovers the full extent of Eleanor's involvement in the rebellion of 1173, the coded correspondence with Louis VII of France, her former husband, the strategic advice to her sons, the promise of Aquitanian support that only she could authorize, the marriage that began in 1152, that produced 8 children and an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, curdles in this moment into something beyond reconciliation. The particular cold of Winchester in winter reaches you now, though the calendar has advanced, the leaves of the following autumn already fallen, the first frosts of 1174 whitening the meadows where you walk. Eleanor's imprisonment begins in this year, the Duchess of Aquitaine become a prisoner of her husband, the Queen reduced to a status that law and custom had not anticipated. Henry II keeps her under close guard, though her material conditions vary with his calculations of political necessity, and perhaps with the residue of feeling that 22 years of shared life cannot entirely extinguish. She is held at various locations, including Chinon, Salisbury, and Winchester. The movements themselves are a form of control, preventing the attachment to place that might foster conspiracy, the familiarity with servants that might breed loyalty beyond his surveillance. The distant bells of Easter, marking years of absence from the world, sound across the water meadows where you stand, their bronze voices carrying the news of resurrection to a woman whose own rebirth has been indefinitely postponed. The scratch of Henry's clerks using her seal, the Duchess present only in wax, accompanies the administrative routine of the kingdom. Henry II continues to employ her seal on documents when convenient for his purposes, the fiction of her consent maintained for transactions that require the Queen's participation, the legal theatre of marriage performed with props that she no longer touches. You might observe this process in the Chancery Office, the heated wax accepting the impression of her authority, the document proceeding to its destination with the momentum of bureaucratic habit. The narrowing of windows at Salisbury reduces the world to rectangles of light, and you are standing in the chamber where these apertures frame sections of sky, of wall, of the occasional passing figure in the courtyard below. Eleanor's confinement lasts 15 years, a duration that corresponds to much of her 50s and early 60s, the decades when a woman of her energy and intelligence might otherwise have consolidated her legacy, patronized the arts of her native South, guided the fortunes of her children into settled adulthood. Instead, the years pass in the rhythm of guarded movements, the occasional relocation for political reasons, including appearances at court where her presence serves Henry II's purposes of display, the loyal wife restored to proximity, if not to power. The troubadours who once competed for her favor at Poitiers have dispersed or died, their songs surviving in manuscripts that do not reach her, the musical culture of her youth becoming a memory that sharpens with distance rather than fading. You are sitting now, perhaps, in the chamber at Winchester, where the fire burns with insufficient warmth, the particular cold of this place in winter penetrating the stone, despite the labor of servants who bring fuel from the distant woodlands. The flames illuminate the tapestries that Henry has allowed to remain, scenes of hunting and courtly love that mock a condition with their images of freedom and desire. Richard remains particularly close to his mother and her heritage in Aquitaine, his identification with the southern territories that she granted him before the rebellion marking him as her truest heir. During the years of her imprisonment, he campaigns in her name against the rebellious barons of his duchy, building the reputation for military ferocity that will carry him to kingship and to Crusade. You might stand on the battlements of a castle in Poitiers, watching his forces approach across the valley, the banners displaying the Lion of England quartered with the flowers of Aquitaine, his mother's legacy carried forward in his body and his ambition. Geoffrey, too, survives, Breton by marriage, his own restlessness driving him to repeated conflict with his father, the pattern of rebellion established in 1173 becoming a family tradition that Henry II cannot break. The years passing, children dying, power slipping away in confinement, compose the slow tragedy of Eleanor's middle age. Young Henry, the eldest son, dies in 1183 during the ongoing conflicts, his body worn out by the campaigning that his father forced upon him, his rebellion ending not in victory, but in fever and regret. Eleanor receives this news in the chamber where the narrowing of windows at Salisbury has reduced her world to rectangles of light, the rectangle perhaps containing a section of sky that she cannot reach, a bird that she cannot follow. She is unable to mourn publicly, her status as prisoner preventing the ceremonies of grief that her rank would normally command, the obsequies that a mother of a king deserves. The death of young Henry removes the figure around whom the original rebellion of 1173 had cohered, the crowned king who never ruled, his empty title passing to memory, and then to the silence that surrounds failed claimants. The particular cold of Winchester in winter persists through the years, and you return to this place as the calendar advances, the same insufficient fires, the same stone walls that seem to generate their own chill regardless of season. Geoffrey dies in 1186, leaving Richard and John as surviving sons, the narrowing of possibilities matching the narrowing of Eleanor's windows, the future of the Angevin Empire concentrating in the two brothers who most thoroughly opposed their father. The scratch of Henry's clerks using her seal continues, the Duchess present only in wax, her legal personality maintained for transactions that she does not authorize, the documents accumulating in the archives that future historians will search for evidence of her agency. She is occasionally moved for political reasons, including appearances at court where Henry II displays her as evidence of his magnanimity or his control, depending on the message he wishes to convey. The 15 years of her imprisonment become a symbol of Henry II's authority over his restless family, the wife confined as warning to sons who continue their rebellions from the safety of French territory. You might observe one of these appearances, the elderly queen moving through the hall with the stiffness that confinement produces, her glance passing over the assembled courtiers without settling, her voice when she speaks carrying the accent of the South that decades in England have not erased. Henry II had a relationship with Rosamund Clifford during this period, the famous beauty of the court, whose legend would later accrete the story of poison and labyrinth that belongs to a different imagination than the historical record supports. Whether Eleanor knew of this relationship, whether it added particular bitterness to her confinement, the sources do not clearly reveal, though the human probability invites speculation that the sleep narration must resist, must leave in the realm of possibility where the viol may sound without performer. The particular cold of Winchester yields to the different temperatures of Chinon, of other castles whose names the chroniclers record or omit. Eleanor's imprisonment ends only with Henry II's death, the causal connection that structures her liberation with the precision that her own prayers, if she offered them, could not achieve. She outlives her captor by nearly 15 years, the symmetry of duration suggesting some narrative pattern that the historical record neither confirms nor denies, the numbers themselves offering their own form of meaning to those who seek structure in the passage of time. The final illness of Henry II, Eleanor waiting, 67 years old and still calculating, occupies the winter of 1188 and 1189. You're standing in the chamber where the news arrives, the fire burning low, the particular cold of this December night penetrating despite the precautions of the household. The rebellion of 1173, the confrontation that ended the marriage, the years of confinement since 1174, all converge in this moment when the husband's body fails and the wife's opportunity arrives. Richard, her closest son, her heir in spirit, and in the southern territories that defined her identity, moves toward England and the crown that his father's death will place upon his head. The scratch of Henry's clerks using her seal has ceased. The Duchess, present only in wax, becoming once more a person who can touch, can command, can speak with the authority that imprisonment temporarily suspended, but did not permanently destroy. You might stand in the corridor where she passes, the elderly woman moving with a deliberation that suggests both the stiffness of confinement and the determination of one who has spent 15 years planning this return. The particular cold of Winchester in winter, the narrowing of windows at Salisbury, the scratch of Henry's clerks using her seal, all these sensory anchors belong to a past that Eleanor carries in her body, even as she moves into a future that will exceed in its achievements what she might have imagined in the darkest years. She would live to see Richard crowned, to govern England during his Crusade, to outlast him and see John crowned in his place, to die in 1204 at the age of 82, her longevity itself, a form of victory over the husband who sought to contain her. The rebellion of 1173, the imprisonment of 1174, become episodes in a longer narrative that she will help to write in the years of freedom that remain, the quill moving across parchment with her own hand, the seal impressed with her own pressure, the Duchess of Aquitaine present in more than wax. The fire in the chamber where you stand has burned to embers, the grey ash holding its heat with the reluctance of stone, and the night has advanced sufficiently that the first suggestion of dawn appears in the eastern rectangles of the windows. The sleep that approaches offers its own form of court, its own ceremonies of release and return, the body settling into the positions that rest requires, the mind loosening its grip on the sequence of years and names that the narration has traced. Eleanor's story continues beyond this chapter, beyond the liberation of 1189, into the decades of renewed activity that would make her one of the most consequential women of the medieval centuries. But for now, the breathing slows. The cold air moves across the face with the gentleness of departure, the harbour at dawn receding into the freer associations of dream. The morning arrives with grey light pressing against the stone of the castle at Chinon, and you are standing in the corridor where the guards have been posted for 15 years. Their boots scrape against the floor as they step aside, one after another, and the sound is softer than you might have expected after so long a vigil. Eleanor moves through the space they have opened for her, her footsteps steady on the worn flags, and you feel the shift in the air as the door closes behind her for the last time. July 6th, in the year 1189, has brought the end of Henry's reign and the end of her confinement, and the two events are bound together in the silence of that departing figure. She is 67 years old, Eleanor 67, and the woman who emerges from that doorway carries herself with the composure of one who has rehearsed this moment across a decade and a half of waiting. The cold air of the corridor moves across your face as you follow her progress, and you notice how she does not pause or look back at the threshold she has crossed. Outside, the courtyard is filling with the subdued bustle of a court in transition. Men speak in lowered voices, and the horses shift in their stalls, their breath rising in the morning cool. The particular quality of dawn light through the castle windows falls across the packed earth, and you observe how Eleanor's shadow stretches before her, longer now than it would have been in the years before her imprisonment, when she moved through similar spaces with the energy of a younger woman. The unfamiliar weight of a seal of state after 15 years of disuse will soon rest in her hands again. But for this hour she walks without insignia, simply a widow released from confinement by the death of her husband. The sky above Chinon is clearing to a pale and fragile blue, and somewhere beyond these walls the news is travelling that Henry II died on July 6, 1189, at Chinon, that Richard I succeeded his father as King of England, that Eleanor was released from imprisonment immediately upon Henry's death. The corridors of Westminster await her, and you find yourself there in the weeks that follow, standing in the spaces where the administration of England gathers its slow momentum. The particular quality of dawn light through Westminster's windows, seen again after decades, touches the pale stone of the arches and the darker wood of the benches where clerks bend to their work. Eleanor is 67 years old, and she moves through these chambers with an assurance that suggests the imprisonment has been merely a brief interruption in a life of governance. You watch her receive the messengers who come from across the Channel, from the territories that Richard must secure before his greater enterprise can begin. The seal of state passes from hand to hand, and you notice how she handles it with the familiarity of long practice, as though the years at Chinon and elsewhere have been no more than a season of withdrawal. Richard stands in these rooms too, and you observe the dynamic between mother and son with the quiet attention that the scene invites. He is restless, this new king, already turning his mind toward Jerusalem and the Holy Land, and you sense in his movements the impatience of a man who has waited for his father's death to begin his true life. Eleanor governs beside him, and Richard entrusts her with significant authority in a trust that seems to acknowledge no gap in their political partnership. The scratch of abacuses as clerks calculate the expenses of Crusade provides a continuous undertone to the conversations you witness, the numbers clicking into place with the regularity of rain. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of wool and wine along the river, and the sounds of commerce rise through the morning mist to mingle with the more austere rhythms of the court. The preparations extend through the months of 1189 and into 1190, and you find yourself at the harbour at dawn, watching the ships assemble for Richard's departure. The cold air moves across your face with the salt of the Channel, and the rigging of the vessels creaks in the offshore wind. Eleanor is present, though she stands apart from the more demonstrative farewells that surround the crusading host, and you note the composure with which she observes her son's embarkation. Richard departed for the Holy Land in 1190, and the kingdom he left behind was not unattended. She acted as regent in England, while Richard went on the Third Crusade, and the assumption of this responsibility appears in her bearing as simply the next necessary action in a life of continuous duty. The water shifts against the hulls of the departing ships, and the light on the horizon is the pale gold of early spring, promising little warmth for the voyage ahead. The governance of England during Richard's absence occupied the years from 1190 to 1194, and you move through this period with Eleanor as she holds the kingdom against the pressures that gather at its edges. The particular quality of dawn light through Westminster's windows accompanies your observation of her daily round, the petitions and judgments and administrative decisions that fill the hours between matins and vespers. She is 67 years old, Eleanor, and then 68, and then 69, the numbers accumulating with the steady progress of the calendars that her clerks maintain. The cold air of winter and the milder currents of English summer move across your face in succession as the seasons turn, and the work continues without interruption. The news arrives in the winter of 1192, carried by ship and horse across the distances that separate England from the Mediterranean world. You are standing in the chamber at Westminster when the messenger enters, his cloak still heavy with the road, and the silence that follows his report is unlike any you have heard in that place. Richard was imprisoned by Leopold, the 5th of Austria, in December 1192, and the words fall into the room with the weight of stones dropped into deep water. Eleanor receives this information with the stillness of one who has learned to absorb catastrophe without visible fracture. and you observe how her hands remain steady on the arms of her chair. He was transferred to Emperor Henry VI, and the conditions of his captivity become the subject of the correspondence that now flows outward from this chamber with renewed urgency. The particular quality of dawn light through Westminster's windows seems colder on the mornings that follow, as though the news has entered the substance of the air itself. The ransom demanded was 100,000 marks of silver, and the figure expands in your mind with the enormity of its impossibility. Eleanor coordinated the collection of this sum across the Angevin territories, and you follow her through the months of relentless labor that this coordination required. The scratch of abacuses as clerks calculate the ransom, numbers beyond comprehension, provides the continuous soundtrack to this period, the beads clicking back and forth with the mechanical persistence of rain on stone. She had to sell properties and impose extraordinary taxes, and you witness the negotiations with barons and bishops, the careful extraction of resources from a realm already strained by the costs of Crusade. The cold air moves across your face in the chambers where these discussions extend into the winter evenings, and the candles gutter in their sconces as the arguments proceed toward their necessary conclusions. The demands of governance now intertwine with the greater project of her son's liberation. The properties sold include lands and rights that had been held for generations, and you observe the documents passing from hand to hand. The seals are fixed with the formality that cannot disguise the desperation of their purpose. The extraordinary taxes fall upon populations already burdened, and the resistance to them requires the full exercise of Eleanor's political skill. She is 67 years old, Eleanor, and older now with each passing month of this extraction, and you note the patience with which she addresses each obstacle, the steady pressure she maintains against the reluctance of those who must contribute. During this period, John Lackland attempted to seize power in England, and the younger brother's maneuvers add another dimension to the difficulties she must navigate. Eleanor remained loyal to Richard throughout, and this loyalty manifests not in declaration, but in the continuous work of preservation, the daily resistance to the fragmentation that John's ambition would promote. The correspondence with Germany extends across months, and you follow the messengers who carry her letters through the winter roads, the seals heavy with the authority she has maintained. The cold of the German journey, Eleanor's age making every winter harder, lies ahead of her, and you sense in her preparations the recognition of what this final phase of extraction will demand. She traveled to Germany to bring Richard home after his release, and the journey is not undertaken lightly by a woman in her 68th year, in her 69th. The horses are chosen with care, the routes planned to minimize the exposure to weather that might delay or endanger, and the provisions assembled with the thoroughness of one who has learned that survival depends upon such preparation. The seal of state has become by now the familiar tool of her authority, and you observe how she carries it with her as she departs England for this last demanding mission. The crossing is rough, and the roads through Flanders present their own difficulties of mud and freezing rain. You are riding in the company of her entourage, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular bite of a continental winter, different in quality from the damp chill of England. The scratch of abacuses has given way to the softer sound of parchment being consulted, the inventories of what has been gathered and what remains to be transferred. Eleanor governs even in motion, and the messages continue to pass between her and the collectors who remain in England and Normandy, ensuring that the final installments of the impossible sum are assembled according to schedule. The particular quality of dawn light through the windows of the castles where she lodges on this journey is thinner than at Westminster, and you notice how she pauses each morning to receive the reports that have overtaken her during the night. Richard was released in February 1194 after approximately 14 months of captivity, and the moment of that release is one you approach with the gravity that Eleanor's presence confers upon it. You are standing in the courtyard of the German castle where the transfer is to occur, and the cold of the German journey, Eleanor's age making every winter harder, has brought her to this threshold with the accumulated weariness of months on the road. The Emperor's representatives stand with their documents, and the silver, the impossible silver, is counted and weighed with the deliberation that such transactions require. Eleanor observes this process with the patience of one who has learned that finality arrives only after the last formality has been satisfied, and you note the straightness of her back, the refusal to bend beneath the accumulated weight of these years. She is 67 years old, Eleanor, and older, and the woman who stands in this German courtyard has carried her kingdom through trials that would have broken a less resilient nature. The door opens, and Richard emerges, and you observe the changes that captivity has worked upon him. The sound of his voice reaches your ears before you see his face clearly, and the alteration in its quality is unmistakable, a certain roughness, a depth that was not present in the younger man who embarked for the Holy Land. They embrace with the formality that their public roles require, and you notice how Eleanor's hand rises to touch his cheek with a gesture that seems to belong to an earlier, more private era of their relationship. The cold air moves across your face in this German courtyard, and the horses stamp in the chill, eager for the road that will carry them away from this place of imprisonment. The journey south begins, and you find yourself riding in the company of their slowly moving procession, the sound of Richard's voice providing the continuous accompaniment to your observation of this return. He speaks of the conditions of his imprisonment, of the journey to the Holy Land and the battles fought there, and Eleanor listens with the attentiveness that is itself a form of governance, gathering information, assessing the state of the man she has labored to liberate. Her governance demonstrated her continued administrative competence, and you observe how even in this period of return she continues to manage the affairs that press upon the kingdom from which they are both temporarily absent. The messengers find them on the road, and the seal is affixed to documents that Eleanor has reviewed during the halts of their journey. The cold air moves across your face as you ride, and the landscape gradually changes from the forests of the German territories to the more cultivated fields of the Low Countries. The Channel appears at last, and you stand with them on the coast, watching the ships that will carry them back to England. The sound of Richard's voice has accompanied you through hundreds of miles, and now it falls silent as they contemplate the water that separates them from their kingdom. Eleanor stands at the edge of this return with the composure of one who has learned that completion is itself a form of beginning, and you sense in her stillness the recognition that the work of governing will resume with renewed intensity once they reach English shores. The particular quality of dawn light through Westminster's windows awaits them across that water, and the thought of it seems to touch her face with an anticipation that is almost visible. The crossing is accomplished, and the progress toward London brings them through landscapes that Eleanor has known across 7 decades of life. You observe the reception that awaits them, the crowds that gather with a curiosity that has been sharpened by the reports of Richard's captivity and Eleanor's labor to secure his release. The particular quality of dawn light through Westminster's windows greets her return to that place of governance, and you follow her through the chambers where the work immediately resumes, the accumulated business of 4 years of absence demanding immediate attention. The scratch of abacuses, as clerks calculate the remaining debts of the ransom, provides a continuous undertone to this renewed labor, the numbers gradually diminishing toward a final accounting. She was the first woman to appear on English coins during Richard's reign, and you hold one of these coins in your hand, feeling its weight, observing the profile that has been struck into the silver with the skill of the royal mint. Eleanor gazes from this small surface with the composure of one who has become, in her 7th decade, an icon of the authority she exercises. The cold air moves across your face in the mint where these coins are struck, and the rhythm of the hammers provides a percussion to match the click of the abacuses in the counting houses nearby. The particular quality of dawn light through the high windows falls upon the silver discs as they emerge from their dies, and the gleam of them seems to carry something of Eleanor's own resilience. The years that follow 1194 extend beyond the scope of this chapter, but you remain with her through the immediate aftermath of the return, observing how the governance of England continues to flow through her hands. The sound of Richard's voice has given way to the sound of his voice in council, arguing for the continuation of his military ambitions, and you observe how Eleanor listens, how she advises, how she continues to hold the practical administration while he dreams of further crusades. Eleanor governed England during his absence, which lasted from 1190 to 1194, and the success of that governance is visible in the stability of the realm she has preserved, the institutions that continue to function, the recognition of her authority that has been formalized in metal and in law. The cold air moves across your face with the gentleness of departure, and the harbor at dawn recedes into the freer associations of dream, the ships waiting, the water calm, the years of confinement and extraction and journeying resolved into the quieter rhythms of a governance that continues, that extends beyond this chapter, beyond the liberation of 1189 and the return of 1194, into the decades of renewed activity that would make her one of the most consequential women of the medieval centuries. The April rain of Poitou falls softly against stone older than memory, and you are standing in the courtyard of a castle whose walls have witnessed the whole span of a life that began in this same region 82 years before. Around you, the wet cobblestones glisten with the particular grey light of early spring, and somewhere in the distance, a bell marks the hour without urgency, its tone dissolving into the damp air like breath into cold water. Richard I died on April 6, 1199, at Châlus-Chabrol near Limoges, and the news of it travels through the spring mud of western France with the terrible slowness that governs all tidings of mortality in this age, before the instant transmission of sorrow. You move through an archway into a chamber where parchment maps lie half-rolled upon a table, their ink bleeding slightly in the humidity that has seeped through shuttered windows, and the particular silence of a room where an old woman has stopped breathing seems already to hover at the edges of your perception, though Eleanor of Aquitaine still lives, still calculates, still governs the vast inheritance that had outlasted 2 husbands and all but 2 of her many children. She was 41 years old when she bore that son who has been killed by a crossbow bolt during a minor siege that has nonetheless ended the reign of the man called Lionheart and thrown into question the entire structure of succession that his mother had spent decades constructing through marriage, diplomacy, and war. The calculation of succession begins before the body of Richard I has begun its long journey to Fontevraud, and you are present in the chambers where Eleanor receives the messengers who bring confirmation of what rumour has already whispered through the corridors of power from Poitiers to Westminster. John Lackland succeeded his brother as King of England, but this succession was neither automatic nor uncontested, for Arthur of Brittany existed, the son of her deceased son Geoffrey, a boy of 12 who represented the claim of primogeniture through the elder brother whose death in a tournament in Paris had preceded Richard's own violent end by nearly a decade. Eleanor supported John's succession against the claims of Arthur of Brittany, and this choice, which you observe her making in the candlelit hours of that April of 1199, reveals the pragmatic ruthlessness that has allowed her to survive imprisonment, widowhood, and the loss of so many of the children she had borne into a world that consumed them with apparent indifference. The scent of lilies placed too late for the living seems to permeate the chamber where she writes, though the season is wrong for lilies, and this is only the anticipation of future griefs, the way that memory and imagination blur in the consciousness of the very old. The carved stone of Fontevraud, cool even in summer, receiving its extraordinary tenant, waits still in the valley of the Vienne, and you find yourself walking there in imagination, as Eleanor herself must have walked there in the weeks after Richard's death, supervising the burial of the son she had ransomed from German captivity at a cost that had nearly bankrupted her kingdom. You stand in the nave of that remarkable abbey, its Romanesque vaults creating spaces of acoustic perfection where even a whisper carries to distant pillars, and you observe how the light falls through clerestory windows onto the recumbent figure of Richard I, his effigy showing him in the attitude of eternal rest, his hands folded, his eyes closed to the world that had granted him so much glory and so little peace. The extraordinary journey to Castile in 1200 unfolds before you like a scroll being unrolled by unseen hands, and you are riding in the entourage of a woman who is approximately 76 years old during this journey, her body perhaps aching with the accumulated miles of a lifetime that had included the arduous crossing to the Holy Land in her 30s and the punitive confinement in English castles during her 60s. She undertook this mission to select a bride for the heir to the French throne, and you observe her pursuing it through the mountain passes of the Pyrenees and the dusty plains of Castile, demonstrating the continued centrality of her diplomatic expertise to the survival of the Anglo-French condominium that her own marriage to Henry II had created, and that her sons had so nearly destroyed through their fratricidal conflicts. The cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of high altitude, and you see how Eleanor's attendants wrap her in furs against the evening chill, how the candles in the chambers where she negotiates flicker with each draught from ill-fitting casements, how her voice, recorded only in the outcomes of her diplomacy rather than in any surviving utterance, must have commanded the respect of courts, where she had been known for nearly 60 years as Queen first of France, and then of England. The particular silence of a room where an old woman has stopped breathing seems to follow her even as she lives and moves and decides, and you sense in the descriptive passages of this journey the shadow of the ending that approaches, the way that a narrative gains weight from the knowledge of its conclusion, even as it pretends to unfold in the present tense of happening. She continued to issue charters and govern Aquitaine, and in the archives of Poitiers and Bordeaux, you might still find the documents that bear her seal, the authentication of her continued authority in the duchy that had been hers before any marriage, made her something larger and more complex in the political geography of 12th century Europe. The French King Philip, the second Augustus, exploited John's weakness to seize continental territories, and you observe this process from the vantage of Eleanor's final years. The way that the son she had supported against his nephews claim proved unable to hold what his brother had barely retained, and his father had assembled through decades of ruthless expansion. The War of 1202 to 1214 resulted in massive French gains, and in the narrative that you follow, this disaster unfolds with the grinding inevitability of continental drift, the separation of England from its continental possessions becoming apparent only in retrospect, the individual battles and sieges and diplomatic betrayals accumulating into a transformation that would make the channel a boundary rather than a corridor. The cold air moves across your face as you stand with Eleanor in some imagined tower, watching smoke rise from distant fires that mark the progress of armies she can no longer command. The April rain of Poitou falling softly against stone, older than memory and older, too, than the political arrangements that are dissolving in the spring mud of yet another campaigning season. The final return to Poitiers, the city of her birth and her death, draws you into the narrative with the gravitational pull of a completed circle, and you find yourself in the palace of the Counts of Poitou, where an infant had been born to William X and his Norman Duchess in 1124, a girl who would outlive nearly all her contemporaries and witness the transformation of Europe from the fragmented lordships of the early 12th century to the more centralized monarchies that were emerging by its end. Eleanor died on April 1, 1204, at Poitiers, and the last days of March 1204, the spring she will not see complete, unfold before you with the terrible clarity of historical knowledge, each hour measured against the diminishing returns of a body that has traveled too far and survived too much. She was 82 years old, and this span, which you have traversed in the compressed time of narration, represents one of the longest lives recorded for any woman of her century, a duration made possible by the relative security of her final decades, and by the robust constitution that had carried her across mountain ranges and through imprisonment and into the active exercise of power at an age when most of her contemporaries had long since entered the retirement that preceded their deaths. The burial at Fontevraud, the final rest between the husband who imprisoned her and the son she ransomed, draws you southward again through the landscapes of her power and her memory, and you travel in the cortege that bears her body to the abbey where Henry II already lay in the extraordinary configuration of recumbent effigies that still constitutes one of the most remarkable royal mausoleums in Europe. She was buried at the abbey of Fontevraud, and you stand now in the choir of that church, where the four figures are arranged with the symmetry that she herself had perhaps planned: the husband and the wife, the son and the daughter-in-law, the family that had destroyed itself through ambition and suspicion, and the sheer geographical impossibility of governing an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. The last light on her effigy, the book still open, the reading never finished, falls through windows that have been altered by centuries of restoration and rebuilding, and you observe how the carved stone captures something of the alert intelligence that had characterized her living presence, the way that her hands rest upon the open pages of a book that she will never now complete. The cold air moves across your face in the evening of this visitation, and you notice how the April rain of Poitou has begun again, softly against stone older than memory, the same rain that fell on the day of her death, and that will continue to fall on the abbey that houses her remains through the centuries that separate her world from yours. She lies between her husband Henry II and her son Richard I, and this placement, which you observe with the knowledge of all that passed between them in life, suggests the reconciliation that death sometimes accomplishes and that the living so rarely achieve. Her effigy shows her reading, a queen to the end, and this representation, which you study in the particular silence that descends upon Fontevraud in the hours when tourists have departed and the custodians make their final rounds, conveys the cultural ambition that had marked her entire career, the insistence upon literacy and learning as attributes of power that distinguished her from many of her royal contemporaries who relied more exclusively upon the sword and the seal. The Angevin Empire she helped build collapsed within a generation of her death, and you understand this collapse as you stand in the abbey where she lies, the way that John's defeat at Bouvines in 1214 and his submission in the Magna Carta of 1215 represent the final dissolution of the political structure that Henry II had assembled and that Eleanor had sustained through her long widowhood.